The complete Justice League story, full history to sleep to. Introduction. Somewhere above the clouds, past the reach of city lights and the hum of late-night traffic, there is a place where the world's protectors gather. Not because they need each other's company, though sometimes they do. Not because they are the same, because they almost never are. They gather because somewhere, always, there is a threat too large for one set of shoulders to carry alone. This is the idea at the heart of the Justice League. A team built not from sameness, but from difference. A god from a dying world who chose to become a symbol of hope. A man with no powers at all, who decided that fear itself could be turned into a weapon against those who prey on the innocent. A princess from a hidden island of warriors, raised on truth and compassion in equal measure. A scientist struck by lightning who became the fastest living thing on Earth. A test pilot handed a ring built from the purest force of will in the universe. A king of a civilization beneath the waves, torn between two worlds that rarely understand each other. A visitor from Mars, the last of his kind, learning slowly what it means to belong somewhere new. Alone, each of them is already remarkable. Together, they became something else entirely, not just a team, but an idea. The idea that the world's greatest dangers could be met not by a single champion, but by a family of them, each filling in where the others could not reach. The story of the Justice League spans more than 60 years of comic book history, across multiple versions of reality, multiple rosters, and multiple eras of storytelling. It has been rewritten, reset, and reimagined more than almost any other team in comics. And through all of it, one thing has stayed constant. When the world needs saving and no single hero is enough, the League answers. Tonight, we're going to walk slowly through that history. From the quiet years before the team existed, through its founding, its many transformations, its darkest moments and its most hopeful ones, all the way to the version of the League that exists today. There is no need to remember every detail. There is no test at the end. Let the story wash over you the way a familiar one does, and if you drift off before we reach the end, the story will still be here waiting whenever you return to it. There is something worth noticing about the shape of this particular story before we begin. Most superhero tales are, at their core, stories about one person. A single origin, a single city, a single set of choices that define a single life. The story of the Justice League is different because it is really many stories, running alongside one another, occasionally colliding, occasionally drifting apart, and every so often converging into something none of them could have written alone. Following it means following not one thread but 7, and later many more than 7, each one distinct, each one worth its own quiet attention. It also means following the story of an industry and of a country, changing around these characters as the decades passed. The Justice League was born in a particular moment in comic book history, shaped by particular editors and writers working under particular pressures, and it has been reshaped again and again by every era that followed. Understanding the team means understanding a little of that history too. The quiet, human decisions made in editorial offices decades ago that still echo through every version of the team that exists today. None of that needs to feel like homework. Think of it instead the way you might think of an old, well-loved neighborhood, one that has been built and rebuilt many times over the years, with new buildings rising where old ones once stood, and older streets still visible underneath the newer ones if you know where to look. The Justice League is a little like that. Layers upon layers, each one still present in some form, even after everything around it has changed. Settle in if you haven't already. Dim the lights if they aren't already dim. There's no need to hold onto every name or every date that follows tonight. Let the broad shape of the story carry you instead. The sense of 7 very different people slowly becoming a family of that family growing and changing across generations, of villains rising and falling, of quiet moments between the chaos where these extraordinary people simply exist together, trading stories, watching over a sleeping world from somewhere far above it. Whatever you remember by morning, or whatever slips away into dreams before we're finished, the story itself will have done exactly what it was meant to do. Let's begin, as most good stories do, before anyone knew what was coming. Chapter 1: Before the League. Long before there was a team, there were individuals. Each of them arrived in the world differently, shaped by different griefs and different discoveries, and each of them became a hero for reasons entirely their own. Superman came first, in the most literal sense. He began not as a member of any team, but as the very idea of the superhero itself, the character whose existence in the late 1930s created an entire genre almost by accident. Born Kal-El on the planet Krypton, he was sent to Earth as an infant by his parents, Jor-El and Lara, moments before their world was destroyed. He was found and raised in Kansas by Jonathan and Martha Kent, who taught him that his extraordinary abilities meant nothing without an equally extraordinary sense of responsibility. Under Earth's yellow sun, his body developed powers far beyond what any human could achieve: immense strength, flight, near invulnerability, and senses that could take in the whole of a city at once. But what made Superman matter in every era of his history was never really the powers. It was the choice he made, over and over, to use overwhelming strength gently. He became a symbol before he became a soldier, a reminder that power did not have to corrupt the person who held it. There is something worth sitting with in that upbringing, the particular quiet of a Kansas farm, far from any city, where a boy capable of lifting a tractor over his head learned instead to be patient, to listen, to notice when someone smaller than him needed help before they asked for it. By the time he moved to Metropolis and took up work as a journalist under the name Clark Kent, he had already decided, long before anyone knew what he was capable of, what kind of person he intended to be. The cape and the powers came second. The decision came first. Batman arrived by a very different road. Bruce Wayne was a child of Gotham City, a place that would come to define him as much as any origin story could. As a boy, he watched his parents, Thomas and Martha Wayne, murdered in an alley after a night at the theater, and in the years that followed, that single moment reshaped everything about who he would become. Rather than let grief consume him, he turned it into discipline. He trained his body and mind for years, studying detection, chemistry, psychology, and combat, until he had built himself into something capable of striking fear into the criminals who preyed on a city that often felt beyond saving. He took on the identity of Batman, a creature of the night meant to frighten the superstitious and cowardly, and unlike many of his future teammates, he had no powers at all. Everything he accomplished through will, preparation, and an unwillingness to ever stop trying. What made Bruce Wayne's approach so distinct, even among a growing generation of costumed heroes, was his insistence on treating heroism as a discipline rather than a gift. He traveled the world before ever putting on the cowl, studying under masters of martial arts, forensic science, and criminal psychology, assembling himself piece by piece into a weapon aimed entirely at the kind of tragedy that had taken his parents from him. By day, he maintained the public persona of a wealthy, somewhat aimless industrialist, a mask every bit as deliberate as the one he wore at night. Few of his eventual teammates would ever fully understand what it cost him to keep going, night after night, without any power to fall back on except his own refusal to quit. Wonder Woman's story began on the Themyscira, a hidden island home to the Amazons, a nation of warrior women shaped by the gods of Olympus and set apart from the world of men. Princess Diana grew up trained as a warrior and diplomat, raised to believe that strength and compassion were not opposites but partners. When an American pilot named Steve Trevor crashed near the island, Diana made the choice to leave her home and enter the wider world, carrying with her the Amazon's values of truth, love, and justice. She would go on to be recognized as one of the most powerful beings ever to walk the earth. But what distinguished her, again and again throughout her history, was her refusal to see violence as the only answer, even when facing enemies who understood no other language. Diana's upbringing on Themyscira had prepared her for combat, certainly, but it had prepared her just as thoroughly for diplomacy, for the belief that most conflicts, even the most seemingly hopeless ones, could be resolved through understanding rather than domination. This made her, from the very beginning, a different kind of hero than the world of men was used to seeing, someone who could stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful threats imaginable and still choose, whenever possible, to offer her opponent a path towards something better than destruction. The Flash's story exists in more than one version across DC's history, a detail that will come up often as we move forward, because the identity of the fastest man alive has passed between more than one person over the decades. In the earliest telling, police scientist Barry Allen was struck by lightning and doused in chemicals during a laboratory accident, an event that granted him the ability to move at speeds beyond human comprehension. He took the name Flash in tribute to a hero from an earlier generation, and where some might have used such power for spectacle, Barry used it with the same quiet diligence he brought to his work as a scientist, treating heroism less as a calling and more as simply the right thing to do with what he had been given. There was a certain unassuming quality to Barry that set him apart from many of his eventual teammates. He was not driven by tragedy in the way Bruce Wayne was, nor born into destiny the way Diana or Superman had been. He was, at heart, a careful, methodical man who happened to gain an extraordinary gift, and who chose, almost as a matter of course, to use it responsibly. That unglamorous decency would come to define the entire Flash legacy for decades to come, no matter who wore the name. Green Lantern's history is similarly layered, built around not a single person but an entire intergalactic organization. The Green Lantern Corps was formed by the immortal Guardians of the Universe, a group tasked with maintaining order across all of existence. Each Corps member is chosen by a power ring capable of translating willpower into nearly any form imaginable, and each ring seeks out a successor whenever a previous bearer dies or steps down. Hal Jordan, a test pilot from Earth, was chosen after the previous ring bearer assigned to his sector was mortally wounded, and used his ring's power to search out a successor without fear. Hal became one of Earth's most prominent Green Lanterns, a man whose greatest strength and greatest weakness were often the same thing, an almost reckless refusal to accept that anything was impossible. Where Barry Allen approached heroism with careful diligence, Hal approached it with something closer to raw nerve. His willingness to fly directly into danger without hesitation made him an invaluable asset in a crisis, the kind of person who acted first and calculated the odds later, if at all. It also meant that of all the League's eventual founders, Hal was perhaps the most prone to conflict with authority, whether that authority came from the Guardians who had chosen him, or, eventually, from his own teammates. Aquaman, born Arthur Curry, carried the burden of two worlds from the moment of his birth. His father was a lighthouse keeper, his mother the queen of the underwater kingdom of Atlantis, and Arthur grew up caught between the surface world that did not understand him and an oceanic civilization that did not entirely trust him either. Over time, he came into his royal inheritance, gaining the ability to breathe underwater, to withstand crushing ocean depths, and to communicate with sea life, eventually rising to become king of Atlantis. Where many of his future teammates fought threats that came from above, Aquaman often stood as one of the only heroes capable of understanding the vast, largely unseen world beneath the waves, and much of his story would come to revolve around the tension of belonging fully to neither realm. It's worth pausing on how easy it has historically been for readers unfamiliar with Aquaman's comics to underestimate him, given how differently he has sometimes been portrayed outside of his own stories. Within the comics themselves, Arthur Curry has long been depicted as a genuinely formidable warrior and a thoughtful, burdened ruler, someone who commands armies, negotiates with foreign kingdoms, and carries the weight of an entire civilization most of the surface world never even thinks about. That underwater kingdom, with its own politics, its own history, and its own dangers, would go on to provide the League with some of its richest, least explored territory for storytelling. Martian Manhunter's arrival on Earth was quieter than the others, and in some ways lonelier. Jayon Jayons was a Martian, accidentally transported to Earth by a scientific experiment and stranded there after the device that brought him was destroyed. He soon learned that his own people, the Green Martians, had already been wiped out by a hostile race known as the White Martians, making him among the last of his kind. Gifted with shape-shifting, telepathy, intangibility, and immense strength, Jayon spent years hiding his true form, learning to live among humans while carrying the private grief of a homeworld that no longer existed. Of all the founding heroes, his story is perhaps the most quietly tragic, built around loss and the long, patient work of finding a new place to belong. There is a particular kind of loneliness in Jayon's story that none of his future teammates fully shared, not even Superman, who at least grew up among people who loved him, even if they were not his own kind. Jayon arrived on Earth as an adult, already fully formed, carrying the memory of an entire world and an entire family that no longer existed anywhere except inside his own mind. For years, he lived quietly, disguised, observing humanity from the outside, learning its customs the way a careful anthropologist might, before slowly allowing himself to actually become part of the world he had been studying. That patience, and that willingness to keep opening himself up to connection despite everything he had lost, would come to define him as one of the League's quiet emotional centers in the decades ahead. Each of these figures operated largely on their own in the early years, protecting their own cities or their own corners of the universe, occasionally crossing paths but rarely working together in any organized way. They did not yet know that a threat was coming that none of them could face alone, or that the choices they had each made to keep going, to keep protecting, to keep believing that one person could make a difference, were about to be tested in an entirely new way. It's worth pausing before we move forward to consider what these 7 lives actually had in common, beneath all their obvious differences. Each of them, in their own way, had faced a moment of profound loss or displacement. Superman lost an entire world before he could even remember it. Batman lost his parents on a single, unbearable night. Wonder Woman left behind the only home and family she had ever known. The Flash and Green Lantern each received their gifts suddenly, unexpectedly, forced to build new identities around abilities they never asked for. Aquaman was born already divided between 2 worlds that didn't fully trust him, and Martian Manhunter lost, in the truest sense, everything: his home, his people, his entire species. None of them chose an easy path forward. Each of them could have let that loss harden into something bitter, something closed off from the rest of the world. Instead, each of them, independently, without any coordination or plan, chose the opposite. They chose to turn personal loss into protective purpose, deciding that if the world had taken something irreplaceable from them, they would spend their lives making sure it took less from everyone else. That shared instinct, more than any similarity in their powers or their methods, is what would eventually make them capable of trusting one another enough to stand together. Not because they were the same, but because each of them in their own separate corner of the world had already answered the same fundamental question long before they ever met. Given the chance to walk away from responsibility or to lean into it instead, each of them, every single time, chose to lean in. That test would arrive soon, and it would change the shape of the DC universe forever. Chapter 2: The Birth of the Justice League. By the late 1950s, the American comic book industry had changed considerably from the world that first produced Superman and Batman 2 decades earlier. The wartime boom of costumed heroes had faded through the 1940s, and by the 1950s, many publishers had shifted their attention to other genres entirely. But DC Comics, along with a handful of talented writers and editors, began quietly reviving the idea of the superhero for a new generation. New versions of old characters started appearing. A new Flash, a new Green Lantern, updated takes on familiar concepts built for readers who had grown up without ever seeing the originals. It was against this backdrop that editor Julius Schwartz and writer Gardner Fox, both instrumental in reviving DC's superhero line, arrived at a simple but powerful idea. If individual heroes were popular on their own, what would happen if several of them appeared together in one story, working as a team? The result was the Justice League of America, first introduced to readers in the pages of The Brave and the Bold before earning its own ongoing series shortly after. The founding roster brought together Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, and Martian Manhunter, uniting DC's most prominent heroes under a single banner for the first time in a sustained, ongoing way. It's worth noting that this wasn't entirely without precedent. Back in the 1940s, DC had already experimented with a team book called the Justice Society of America, uniting many of the era's popular heroes, including early versions of The Flash and Green Lantern, in a similar format. That earlier team had faded from publication as the popularity of superhero comics declined through the post-war years. But its example, the basic proof that team-up stories could work, clearly lingered in the minds of the editors who would go on to create the Justice League a decade later. In many ways, the Justice League was less a wholly new idea than a revival and refinement of something DC had already discovered worked, updated for a new generation of heroes and a new generation of readers. The premise was straightforward, and it remains the foundation of nearly every version of the team that followed. Some threats were simply too large, too strange, or too dangerous for any single hero to handle alone. Alien invasions, cosmic anomalies, villains whose power rivaled that of multiple heroes combined. When these threats arose, the League would come together, each member contributing their own particular strength to a problem none of them could solve in isolation. This was, at the time, a genuinely new kind of storytelling for superhero comics. Readers were used to seeing Superman save Metropolis or Batman protect Gotham, each hero operating within his or her own corner of the world. The Justice League asked a different question. What happens when Earth's mightiest protectors are forced to set aside their individual methods and work as a unit? Batman's caution had to coexist with Superman's boundless optimism. Wonder Woman's diplomacy had to find room alongside Green Lantern's willingness to charge directly into danger. The tension and harmony between these different approaches became just as central to the series as the villains they fought. This narrative tension proved remarkably durable precisely because it wasn't manufactured conflict for its own sake. Each hero's approach to a given crisis genuinely reflected who they were as individuals, shaped by everything covered in the previous chapter. Batman's hard-won caution born from personal tragedy, Superman's faith in people earned through a childhood surrounded by decency and love, Wonder Woman's belief in diplomacy rooted in Amazonian philosophy, Green Lantern's willingness to act decisively drawn from years spent as a test pilot trained to make split-second decisions under pressure. When these different instincts collided within a single story, readers weren't watching arbitrary disagreement. They were watching genuine character, tested against genuine stakes, in ways that revealed something true about each hero, even as the team, collectively, worked its way toward a solution none of them could have reached alone. The League's adventures in this earliest period were often built around imaginative, larger-than-life threats, alien despots, reality-warping entities, ancient godlike beings, reflecting the optimistic, exploratory tone of what comic historians now call the Silver Age of comics. The stories were rarely dark. They were closer in spirit to adventure serials, filled with a sense of wonder about what a team of extraordinary people might accomplish together. This optimism wasn't accidental. It reflected the broader cultural mood of the era in which these stories were written, a post-war America increasingly fascinated by space exploration, scientific progress, and the sense that humanity itself stood on the edge of an expansive, hopeful future. The Justice League's adventures, filled with rocket ships, alien worlds, and imaginative scientific concepts, tapped directly into that same cultural excitement, offering readers a superhero-flavored extension of the same wonder that sent astronauts toward the moon within the same general period. The team's willingness to face down cosmic threats without ever losing their fundamental decency or their faith in cooperation gave these stories a warmth that has aged remarkably well, even as the specific scientific and cultural touchstones of the era have inevitably shifted. Importantly, the Justice League of America was not simply a marketing gimmick to sell more comics, though it certainly did that as well. It became, almost immediately, one of DC's most important titles, a place where the company's mythology could intersect and expand. Characters who had never shared a page together now stood shoulder to shoulder. Readers who followed one hero's solo adventures were introduced to others they might never have picked up on their own. The League became, in a very real sense, connective tissue for the entire DC universe. There was also something quietly reassuring for readers picking up these early issues in simply seeing these particular heroes occupy the same page. Comics of this era were often sold and read in isolation, one title at a time, and the idea that Superman might casually greet Batman or that Wonder Woman might trade strategy with the Flash mid-battle gave the DC universe a sense of scale and cohesion that few competitors could match. It suggested that these characters didn't just exist in their own separate bubbles, but inhabited a single, shared world, one large enough to need all of them, and small enough that they might, on occasion, simply run into each other. The team's early headquarters was a secret cave in Happy Harbor, Rhode Island, accessible to the public through a fictional souvenir shop, giving the group a slightly more grounded, almost small-town quality in its earliest days, before the team's scale and ambitions grew alongside DC's storytelling in the years that followed. There's a particular charm in how modestly the League began, especially when set against everything it would eventually become. 7 of the most powerful beings in the DC universe, choosing to base their operations not out of some gleaming fortress or orbital platform, but out of a cave accessible through a small-town tourist shop, feels almost quaint by later standards. But that modesty served a purpose. It grounded the team, at least in its earliest stories, in something recognizably human, a reminder that despite their extraordinary abilities, these heroes still operated within and cared about the ordinary world around them. The early creative team also made a point of establishing a rotating leadership structure among the founders, rather than designating any single member as a permanent commander. Different heroes took charge depending on the nature of the threat at hand. A Green Lantern-led mission calling for one kind of decisive action, a Batman-led investigation calling for another. This structural choice reinforced the series' central thesis from its very first issues, that the team's strength came specifically from its members' willingness to trust each other's judgment in turn, rather than deferring permanently to whichever member happened to be the most powerful. The earliest issues also introduced Snapper Carr, an ordinary teenager who became something like the team's unofficial mascot and honorary member, present at their meetings and occasionally assisting with cases despite possessing no powers of his own. His inclusion, however the character's specific role shifted across later reinterpretations, reflected an instinct that would echo throughout the League's history. The idea that this team, for all its cosmic power, remained fundamentally connected to and invested in the ordinary human world it had sworn to protect. Even at their most powerful, these heroes wanted, in some sense, an ordinary voice in the room, a reminder of exactly who they were ultimately working on behalf of. What began as an experiment in team-up storytelling would go on to become one of the most enduring concepts in all of superhero fiction. But in these early years, none of that legacy had been written yet. The League was simply 7 heroes who had discovered that they were stronger together than any of them could ever be alone, and slowly, issue by issue, they began to prove it. Picture for a moment that early headquarters in Happy Harbor, a quiet stretch of coastline, waves moving slowly against the rocks outside, and beneath it, hidden from the world, a cave lit by soft instrument panels, humming gently with the low sound of monitoring equipment. It is late. Somewhere above, ordinary people sleep in their homes, unaware of the 7 extraordinary individuals gathered quietly below, some resting, some talking softly, none of them expecting the alarm that will eventually call them back into action. For now, though, there's just stillness, the kind that settles over a place built to protect people who will never know how close they came to needing that protection. Chapter 3: The Classic Era. As the Justice League's early stories unfolded through the 1960s, the series settled into a rhythm that would come to define what many longtime readers still think of as the classic era of the team. The threats grew stranger and more ambitious. Time travel, alternate dimensions, and cosmic-scale menaces became regular fixtures of the League's adventures, giving the writers room to explore ideas that wouldn't have fit comfortably into any single hero solo title. What made this period distinct wasn't just the scale of the stories, but the way the team's internal chemistry began to take shape. Superman and Batman, despite their vastly different approaches to heroism, developed a close friendship built on mutual respect rather than similarity. Superman's boundless faith in people balanced against Batman's instinct to prepare for the worst, and rather than one philosophy winning out over the other, the stories often suggested that the team needed both. This particular friendship would go on to become one of the most examined relationships in all of superhero fiction, revisited and reinterpreted by nearly every writer who touched either character in the decades that followed. But its roots trace back to exactly this period, when 2 heroes who might easily have viewed each other with suspicion, an unstoppable alien capable of overpowering nearly anyone, and a mortal man devoted to preparing for every conceivable threat, including, implicitly, threats posed by his own more powerful allies, instead chose something considerably harder and considerably more valuable. Genuine trust, extended deliberately, again and again, despite every rational reason either of them might have had for withholding it. Wonder Woman, during much of this period, found herself in a curious position within the narrative. Early Justice League stories sometimes struggled to give her the same weight afforded to her male teammates, occasionally sidelining her into support roles rather than frontline action. It's worth acknowledging honestly that the treatment of female heroes in this era of comics, including Wonder Woman herself, was often uneven by the standards of later decades, a reflection of the time in which these stories were written rather than any flaw in the character. The Flash brought a certain lightness to the team, his speed often serving as a narrative tool to solve problems quickly, while also occasionally being neutralized by whatever cosmic threat the team faced, forcing him to rely on ingenuity rather than raw power. Green Lantern, meanwhile, often served as the team's most aggressive member, his willpower-based ring making him simultaneously one of the most versatile heroes on the team and one of the most vulnerable, given the ring's well-known weakness to the color yellow. These stories often leaned on a kind of narrative puzzle box structure, presenting a threat so overwhelming that the team's combined powers alone weren't enough, forcing each member to contribute some clever, unexpected application of their abilities before the day could be won. This format rewarded readers who paid close attention to what each hero could actually do, turning the team's diversity of powers into something like a toolbox the writers could draw from issue after issue, always finding new combinations, new problems that required exactly the right hero, in exactly the right moment, applying their gift in a way no one had quite thought of before. Aquaman and Martian Manhunter, for much of this period, occupied slightly more peripheral roles compared to the team's more prominently featured members, though both received moments that highlighted what made them valuable teammates. Aquaman's command of the seas proving crucial in stories involving oceanic threats, and Martian Manhunter's shape-shifting and telepathy often providing solutions no other member of the team could offer. Over these years, the League also began establishing what would become one of its most important annual traditions: team-ups with the Justice Society of America, an earlier generation of DC heroes who, according to the comic's internal logic at the time, existed on a parallel world known as Earth-2. These crossover stories, often taking place across two connected issues, allowed DC to bring its Golden Age heroes back into modern stories, creating a sense of legacy and continuity that few other comic universes had attempted. This multiple Earths concept, introduced almost casually at first, would eventually grow into something far more significant to DC's overall continuity, though it wouldn't fully reveal its consequences for another 2 decades. These annual crossovers carried a particular warmth that readers responded to strongly. There was something moving about watching an older generation of heroes, weathered and experienced, standing alongside a newer generation still finding its footing, each group learning something from the other. The Justice Society's members often approached threats with the accumulated wisdom of heroes who had already lived through a world war and the trials of an earlier age, while the Justice League brought a more modern energy and confidence, still relatively early in writing its own legend. Neither team diminished the other. If anything, the pairing suggested something the League would return to again and again throughout its history: that heroism was not a single generation's burden, but something passed carefully from one group of protectors to the next. Readers got to meet, through these crossovers, an entire earlier generation of heroism, The original Flash, Jay Garrick, whose own superspeed predated Barry Allen's by decades. The original Green Lantern, Alan Scott, whose power came from a magical ring rather than an alien one, and numerous other Golden Age figures whose adventures had first captivated readers during the Second World War. Watching Barry Allen meet Jay Garrick, two heroes sharing the same name and the same fundamental gift despite having never previously crossed paths, offered readers a genuinely moving meditation on legacy, on how an idea, once created, can be passed forward, reshaped, and carried by entirely new hands without ever losing its essential spirit. By the mid-1960s, the Justice League of America had firmly established itself as DC's premier team title, a place where the publisher's most valuable characters could interact in stories too big for any of them to carry alone. The team's identity was no longer just 7 heroes sharing a comic. It had become something more like a family, albeit an unusual one, built from wildly different personalities who had learned, gradually, how to trust one another when the stakes were highest. Part of what made this sense of family feel earned, rather than simply assumed, was the writer's willingness to show these heroes disagreeing, even bickering, over matters both trivial and significant, before ultimately setting those disagreements aside when a genuine threat demanded their full attention. A Green Lantern and a Flash arguing over strategy. A Batman quietly questioning whether the team was moving too quickly toward action without sufficient planning. These weren't stories about a perfectly harmonious team gliding effortlessly from one victory to the next. They were stories about individuals learning, issue by issue, how to fold their very different instincts into something resembling consensus, without any one voice ever completely dominating the conversation. This period also saw the team begin appearing more regularly in guest spots within each member's individual solo titles, and vice versa, with solo characters occasionally appearing in Justice League stories to lend a hand or seek the team's help with a problem too large for them to handle alone. This cross-pollination reinforced the sense of a genuinely unified DC universe, one where a reader following any single hero's adventures might, at any point, find that story intersecting meaningfully with the wider tapestry the Justice League represented. It was a good foundation, and it was about to be tested by a wave of new heroes eager to prove they belonged among the League's ranks. Chapter 4: The Team CHNGS. No team stays the same forever, and the Justice League was no exception. As the 1960s progressed, the roster began to shift, bringing in new members whose personalities and abilities expanded what kinds of stories the team could tell. This willingness to expand and evolve, rather than remaining locked into its original 7-person configuration, may be the single most important editorial decision made in the League's earliest years, one whose consequences echo through every subsequent era discussed in this history. Had the founding roster remained permanently fixed, the team might well have calcified into a static institution rather than the living, breathing family it became, incapable of reflecting the changing tastes of readers or the evolving priorities of the writers tasked with telling its stories decade after decade. Instead, the willingness to keep the door open, to let new heroes prove themselves worthy of joining, established the fundamental flexibility that would let the Justice League survive crisis after crisis, reboot after reboot, remaining recognizably itself across 60 years precisely, because it never insisted on staying exactly the same. Green Arrow, the bow-wielding vigilante Oliver Queen, joined the team during this period, bringing with him a very different flavor of heroism than his teammates. Unlike Batman, whose detective methods and preparation defined him, or Green Lantern, whose power came from an alien ring. Green Arrow relied on mundane, if extraordinarily precise, archery skills, along with a growing social conscience that would come to define his character more and more in the years ahead. He often positioned himself as the League's most outspoken member, unafraid to challenge his teammates or question whether the team's methods were serving ordinary people as well as they should. This willingness to challenge his own teammates would only grow more pronounced in the years ahead, as Oliver Queen's politics shifted leftward, and his stories began engaging more directly with poverty, corruption, and the uncomfortable gap between heroes who could stop an alien invasion, but sometimes struggled to notice suffering happening in their own city's poorest neighborhoods. Within the League specifically, this made Green Arrow something of a conscience figure, a reminder that cosmic threats, however dramatic, weren't the only kind of danger worth taking seriously. Black Canary joined around this same general period as well, bringing her formidable hand-to-hand combat skills and her sonic canary cry to the team. Her addition mattered not just for her abilities, but for beginning, gradually, to correct the earlier imbalance in how the team's female members were written, giving the League another powerful voice alongside Wonder Woman. Dinah Lance's presence on the team also mattered for reasons beyond combat prowess. As the daughter of the original Black Canary from the Justice Society generation, her membership reinforced the League's growing sense of itself as an institution with real lineage and legacy, not simply a static team of individuals, but part of an ongoing tradition passed down, in this case quite literally, from mother to daughter. The Atom, physicist Ray Palmer, brought a wholly different kind of power to the team. Using a size-changing formula derived from a fallen white dwarf star, Ray could shrink down to subatomic scale while retaining his full strength, allowing him to approach problems in ways none of his much larger teammates could manage. His scientific mind also made him a valuable strategist, someone who often solved problems through cleverness rather than force. Ray's particular value to the team often showed up in exactly the moments where raw power proved useless, situations requiring someone capable of navigating microscopic environments, disarming delicate mechanisms from the inside, or simply approaching a problem from an angle no full-sized hero could physically access. His presence on the roster reinforced something the writers seemed to understand intuitively even in these earlier decades, that a team built entirely around overwhelming strength would eventually run into problems strength alone couldn't solve, and that genuine versatility required members whose gifts operated on entirely different scales and principles from one another. Hawkman and Hawkgirl, Qatar and Shayera Hall, joined bringing an entirely different mythology into the League's orbit. Alien police officers from the planet Thanagar, equipped with artificial wings and a devotion to ancient weaponry, the Hawks added a sense of otherworldly history to the team, along with a fierce, sometimes uncompromising approach to justice shaped by their off-world law enforcement background. Their relationship also carried a particular romantic and tragic weight through much of DC's publication history, with various tellings of their story involving reincarnation across centuries, adding a layer of cosmic, almost faded significance to their partnership that set them apart from the League's other members. Whatever the specific version of their history a given era chose to emphasize, Qatar and Shayera brought a warrior's directness to the team that occasionally clashed, productively, with the more measured instincts of teammates like Superman or Wonder Woman. Zatanna, a stage magician whose spells worked by speaking her incantations backward, brought genuine magic into a team that had, up to this point, dealt primarily with science fiction and alien technology. Her presence opened the door for the League to face threats rooted in sorcery and the supernatural, expanding the scope of what kinds of dangers the team might encounter. Zatanna's own history carried real weight as well, tied closely to her father, the stage magician and hero Zatara, whose own disappearance became a recurring thread in her personal story, even as she built her own reputation and her own place among Earth's protectors. Her magic gave the writers an entirely new toolbox to draw from, one governed by very different rules than the science-based abilities most of her teammates relied on, and her presence meant the League could credibly face down demons, curses, and ancient sorcery without needing to stretch its more scientifically minded members into unfamiliar territory. Red Tornado, an android built with genuine, evolving consciousness and control over wind and air currents, added yet another dimension to the team, raising quiet questions, largely ahead of their time for superhero comics, about what it meant to be a person at all, and whether personhood required a biological body. His ongoing search for genuine emotional connection, and his repeated attempts to build something resembling a normal human family despite his artificial origins, gave the character a quiet poignancy that stood in contrast to the more straightforwardly heroic arcs of many of his teammates. Where other members joined the League already secure in their identity, Red Tornado's entire arc across these years remained an open question. Not whether he could fight alongside the League, which he clearly could, but whether he could ever truly belong among people so fundamentally different from himself. Each of these additions mattered for reasons beyond simply expanding the roster. They diversified the kinds of powers the League could draw on, the kinds of problems the team could solve, and the kinds of perspectives represented within it. Green Arrow's social conscience, Black Canary's hard-won combat expertise, the Atom's scientific precision, the Hawk's warrior heritage, Zatanna's magic, Red Tornado's quiet questions about identity and consciousness. None of these additions replaced the founding members' importance, but together they transformed the League from 7 iconic heroes into something closer to a genuine ensemble, capable of responding to nearly any threat imaginable. There was also a practical storytelling benefit to this larger, more varied roster that shouldn't be overlooked. With 7 founding members, certain kinds of stories became difficult to tell simply because the team was, in a sense, too powerful. A group built around Superman, Wonder Woman, and 2 ring-wielding or lightning-fast heroes could feel almost unstoppable against anything short of a genuinely cosmic threat. Adding heroes like Green Arrow, whose skill came without any powers at all, or the Atom, whose usefulness depended on clever application of a very specific gift, gave writers more room to tell stories where victory required teamwork and ingenuity rather than simply overwhelming force. It kept the team's power level in balance with the kinds of stories that made for compelling reading, rather than letting the roster grow so strong that no threat felt believable. This era also began to establish something that would recur throughout the League's history, the sense that membership itself carried weight and meaning within the story. Being invited to join wasn't treated as a formality. It was treated as recognition, an acknowledgement from Earth's most trusted heroes that a new arrival had proven themselves worthy of standing among them. That sense of earned belonging would go on to matter a great deal in later eras, particularly once new, younger heroes began aspiring to join the team their own mentors and predecessors had once belonged to. There's something worth noting, too, about how differently each of these new members approached the idea of joining an already established team. For heroes like Green Arrow, membership meant a platform, a louder voice for causes he cared about deeply, a seat at a table where he could push his more powerful, sometimes more sheltered teammates toward paying closer attention to the ordinary people, their battles so often overlooked. For someone like the Atom, membership meant validation of a sort, confirmation that a hero whose power came from careful scientific application, rather than cosmic inheritance or alien technology, still belonged among legends. For Red Tornado, membership meant something closer to a tentative, hopeful question. Could a being built rather than born ever really be accepted as family? The team's willingness to answer that question, gradually and imperfectly, with an actual yes, said as much about the League's evolving values as any battle they fought during this period. This period of expansion set the stage for what would become an even larger transformation in the years ahead, as the team's ambitions and its headquarters grew to match its now considerably larger family of heroes. Consider, for a moment, what it might have felt like to be one of these newer members, walking into a meeting room already occupied by Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, heroes whose names were already spoken with a kind of reverence across the whole of the DC universe. There must have been nerves in that room, at least at first. A quiet uncertainty about whether you truly belonged among legends, whether your particular gift, however unusual or clever, could really hold its own beside beings capable of moving planets or outrunning time itself. And yet, gradually, issue by issue, that uncertainty would have softened into something more like comfortable familiarity, the particular ease that comes from being trusted repeatedly with responsibilities that matter. That quiet transition from outsider to family is a story this history will return to again and again, because it never really stopped happening, not in the 1960s, not in any era since. Chapter 5: The Satellite Era. By the early 1970s, the modest cave headquarters in Happy Harbor no longer suited a team that had grown so considerably in size and ambition. The Justice League relocated to a new base entirely, an orbital satellite floating high above the Earth, a shift that was more than cosmetic. It reflected a team that now saw its responsibilities as genuinely global, and at times genuinely cosmic, rather than centered on any single town or country. The symbolism of this move deserves a moment of attention. A cave, however secret, remains fundamentally a part of the Earth itself, tucked beneath a particular coastline in a particular country. A satellite, orbiting freely above the entire planet, belongs to no single nation or landscape, positioned instead in a kind of neutral, universal vantage point from which the team could, in principle, respond with equal speed to a crisis anywhere on the globe. This shift mirrored something happening more broadly in the team's stories as well, an expanding sense of scale and responsibility that matched the era's own fascination with space exploration and humanity's first tentative steps beyond the boundaries of Earth itself. This period is often remembered by longtime readers as the Satellite Era, and it represents one of the longest continuous stretches in the League's publication history. The roster during this time became larger and more varied than ever before, folding in the heroes introduced during the team change years alongside the founding seven, and later welcoming still more members as the decade wore on. Life aboard the satellite gave the stories a particular tone. There was something quietly appealing about the image of these extraordinary individuals, gathered far above the ordinary concerns of the world, monitoring for threats, occasionally squabbling over small things the way any family might, and then setting all of that aside the moment real danger appeared. The satellite itself became almost a character in its own right, a symbol of the team's watchfulness, always circling, always ready. The stories from this era leaned further into science fiction spectacle than the League's earliest adventures had. Alien invasions grew more elaborate. Cosmic entities capable of threatening entire star systems became more common opponents. At the same time, the writers used the satellite's more intimate, almost domestic setting to explore quieter character moments between missions, letting readers see the team not just as a fighting unit but as a genuine community, with its own friendships, tensions, and routines. This era also introduced readers to some of the League's more elaborate rogues galleries, expanding beyond the somewhat episodic villain-of-the-month structure of earlier years toward recurring, more fully developed antagonists capable of returning across multiple story arcs. Longer, more serialized storytelling became increasingly common, allowing threats to build gradually across several issues rather than resolving neatly within a single adventure. A structural shift that gave the satellite era's best stories a sense of mounting stakes and genuine consequence that earlier, more done-in-one issues had rarely attempted. New members continued to join during this stretch as well, reflecting DC's ongoing effort to keep the League feeling fresh rather than static. Some stayed for years, becoming as essential to the team's identity as its founders. Others passed through more briefly, their arcs closing before moving on to other corners of the DC universe. This constant, gradual turnover became, in its own way, part of what defined the satellite era. A sense that the League was less a fixed set of 7 names and more a living institution, one that could welcome new members and bid farewell to others without losing its essential identity. Among the notable additions during this period was Firestorm, the Nuclear Man, a hero whose very existence was built around duality. Formed from the fusion of high school student Ronnie Raymond and physicist Martin Stein during a nuclear accident, Firestorm existed as a single being sharing 2 minds and 2 consciousnesses, a physical embodiment of cooperation that echoed, in its own strange way, the League's larger philosophy of individuals combining their strengths to become something greater. His matter manipulation abilities, along with the genuine, ongoing negotiation required between his 2 component personalities, gave the writers a character whose internal dynamic was almost as compelling as his external battles. Elongated Man, Ralph Dibny, brought his own particular flavor to the team as well, a detective whose stretching abilities made him a valuable asset both in combat and in investigation. Ralph's genuine affection for his wife, Sue Dibny, and the warmth of their marriage became a recurring, well-loved element of League stories during this period, offering readers a portrait of one of the team's few genuinely happy, stable, long-term relationships. That happiness, worth remembering now, would eventually become the foundation for one of the League's most difficult stories decades later. Though during the satellite era, the Dibny's marriage simply served as a quiet source of warmth amid the team's more cosmic concerns. The team also welcomed a rotating cast of other heroes during these years, some drawn from established DC lore, others introduced specifically to expand what kinds of stories the League could tell. This willingness to keep experimenting with roster composition, adding heroes whose powers or personalities filled gaps the existing team couldn't cover, reflected an institutional confidence that had grown considerably since the team's earliest, more cautious days. By this point, the Justice League had become secure enough in its own identity that it could afford to take chances on newer, less proven characters, trusting that the team's fundamental values, cooperation, sacrifice, and a shared commitment to protecting a world that couldn't always protect itself, would hold steady no matter who currently sat around the satellite's meeting table. There is something worth lingering on in the image of that satellite itself, quietly circling above a sleeping world. For readers who followed the title through these years, the satellite became a kind of second home, a place they could return to issue after issue, familiar and comforting even as the threats faced within its walls grew stranger and more dangerous. Members would gather in its common areas between missions, trade stories, occasionally argue, and then fall back into the easy rhythm of found family that had defined the team since its earliest days. There was a rec room. There was a monitor womb, where a rotating duty roster of members kept watch for signs of trouble anywhere on Earth. There was, in other words, an actual domestic texture to this era that grounded even the most cosmic storylines in something recognizably human. This era also saw the League continue expanding its bench of recurring members, welcoming heroes who would go on to play significant roles throughout the team's later history, each bringing their own dynamic into the increasingly large ensemble. Rather than diluting the team's identity, this constant influx of new personalities reinforced something that had been true since the League's earliest days: that the team was never meant to be a static roster of exactly 7 names, but a living, breathing institution capable of growing to meet whatever the era demanded of it. By the time this era gave way to the changes of the 1980s, the Justice League had firmly cemented itself as more than just a comic book gimmick. It had become an institution within DC's fictional world, and within the culture of superhero comics more broadly, a proving ground where heroes earned their place among Earth's most trusted protectors, watching over the planet from a quiet vantage point among the stars. If you were to drift, just for a moment, above the Earth alongside that satellite, you might notice how quiet space actually is. No wind, no distant traffic, just the slow turn of the planet below, continents sliding gradually into darkness and back into light, city lights flickering on in patterns too vast to take in all at once. Somewhere inside that orbiting home, a member of the League sits alone on monitor duty, watching those same lights, thinking, perhaps, about how strange and quietly beautiful it is to be entrusted with protecting something this large, this fragile, and this full of people who will never know his or her name. Chapter 6: The Justice League in the Bronze Age. As the 1970s progressed, superhero comics as a whole began to change. What critics and historians now call the Bronze Age brought with it a willingness to engage with subjects the earlier, more whimsical Silver Age had mostly avoided: social issues, moral ambiguity, and consequences that lingered rather than resolving neatly by the final page. The Justice League felt this shift too, though perhaps more gradually than titles like Green Lantern and Green Arrow's shared series, which became famous during this period for tackling subjects like drug addiction and racial inequality head-on. Within the League's own stories, the change showed up less as social commentary and more as a general deepening of tone. Threats felt weightier. Victories came with costs. The team itself, rather than always functioning as a smoothly cooperative unit, began to show more visible friction, disagreements over strategy or ethics that didn't always resolve by the end of an issue. It's worth pausing briefly on that Green Lantern and Green Arrow series specifically, since its influence rippled outward into how both characters were subsequently written within the League itself. Pairing the cosmically minded, somewhat detached Hal Jordan with the increasingly socially conscious Oliver Queen allowed writers to stage direct, pointed conversations about privilege, power, and responsibility. Conversations that Green Arrow, once he returned to League stories, carried with him. His willingness to challenge his teammates, established back during his earliest days on the roster, only grew sharper and more pointed as a result of this period, reinforcing his role as the team's most persistent internal conscience. This era also saw DC beginning to think more seriously about consistency and continuity across its growing library of titles. As more heroes crossed paths in team books like the Justice League, writers and editors had to pay closer attention to how each character's individual history fit into the larger picture. It was a slow, sometimes imperfect process, but it laid groundwork for the far more ambitious continuity project DC would undertake in the following decade. This growing editorial attention to consistency reflected a genuine tension that had been building for years by this point. The same interconnected universe that gave the Justice League its unique storytelling power, the sense that any hero might, at any moment, cross paths with any other, also created an ever-expanding web of continuity that grew harder to manage with each passing year. Every crossover, every guest appearance, every shared storyline added another thread to a tapestry that had, by the late 1970s, grown remarkably intricate. Editors increasingly found themselves serving less as simple gatekeepers of quality and more as genuine continuity historians, tracking which version of which event had actually happened within the shared fictional timeline, and flagging inconsistencies before they made it into print. Membership continued to shift during this period as well, with some longtime members stepping back and newer heroes stepping in, keeping the roster in a state of gradual, ongoing evolution, rather than settling into any single permanent lineup. The team's adventures continued to blend cosmic-scale threats with occasional smaller, more grounded stories, giving the Bronze Age Justice League a slightly wider emotional range than its Silver Age predecessor. It's worth taking a moment here to appreciate what this shift meant for readers who had grown up alongside these characters through the more optimistic, straightforwardly heroic Silver Age. Watching familiar heroes wrestle with genuine doubt, disagreement, and consequence for the first time offered a new kind of emotional investment, one built less on spectacle and more on character. Batman in particular began to take on a more central, sometimes tense role within these stories, his more skeptical, tightly controlled approach occasionally clashing with teammates who preferred a more trusting, straightforward brand of heroism. These frictions never tore the team apart, but they added texture, suggesting that even among Earth's greatest heroes, doing the right thing wasn't always simple and wasn't always something everyone agreed on. Elsewhere in the DC line during this same period, entirely new titles were exploring corners of the universe the Justice League itself rarely visited. Occult investigators, cosmic wanderers, street-level vigilantes operating far from any satellite headquarters. This broadening of DC's overall storytelling palette meant the League increasingly existed as just one part, albeit a central one, of a much larger, more varied fictional universe. One where a reader might follow the team's cosmic adventures one month and a considerably more grounded, character-driven story the next, all while understanding both to be taking place within the same shared reality. By the early 1980s, larger changes were beginning to stir, not just within the pages of the Justice League, but across the entirety of DC's fictional universe. The multiple Earths concept that had once been a source of fun, nostalgic crossovers was, behind the scenes, becoming an increasingly complicated problem for writers trying to keep track of decades of overlapping continuity. The Bronze Age also coincided with broader cultural shifts taking place throughout the 1970s, and while the Justice League itself rarely tackled real-world social issues as directly as some of DC's other titles during this period, the general willingness across the industry to treat superhero comics as capable of more mature, thoughtful storytelling left its mark on the team's adventures nonetheless. Villains grew more psychologically complex, victories felt less automatic, and the sense that these characters existed within a coherent, consequential universe, rather than a collection of disconnected adventures, continued to deepen with each passing year. It's worth noting how the League's roster during these years reflected a growing editorial confidence in letting the team's membership breathe and change organically, rather than treating the founding seven as a permanently fixed core that newer additions simply orbited around. Members occasionally stepped away for extended periods, tending to personal matters or solo adventures elsewhere in the DC universe, only to return later, welcomed back without much ceremony, simply folded back into the team's ongoing story as though they had never left. This fluid approach to membership, neither rigidly permanent nor casually disposable, gave the Bronze Age Justice League a lived-in quality that distinguished it from the more tightly curated, symbolically weighted rosters of later eras. Something was going to have to give, and when it did, it would touch every corner of the DC universe, the Justice League very much included. Chapter 7: Crisis on Infinite Earths. To understand why Crisis on Infinite Earths mattered so much, it helps to understand the problem it was trying to solve. For decades, DC had told stories using the idea of a multiverse, the notion that many parallel Earths existed alongside one another, each slightly different, each home to its own versions of familiar heroes. The Justice League, as we've discussed, lived on what was internally called Earth 1. The heroes of the 1940s, the previous generation who had inspired many of DC's modern characters, lived on a separate world called Earth 2, home to the Justice Society of America. Other Earths existed too, home to other characters entirely, including some acquired from other publishers over the years. This setup allowed for charming, nostalgic stories, like the annual team-ups between the Justice League and the Justice Society. But by the mid-1980s, it had also become a genuine burden. New readers found the layered, decades-old continuity nearly impossible to follow. Even longtime fans struggled to keep track of which version of which character existed on which Earth, and why. DC's editorial team made the decision to simplify everything, dramatically, through a single, universe-spanning story. Crisis on Infinite Earths was the result, a 12-issue limited series in which nearly every hero and villain across DC's multiple parallel Earths united to fight the Anti-Monitor, an entity from the antimatter universe responsible for destroying Earth after Earth as the story unfolded. It was, at the time, one of the largest and most ambitious crossover events in comic book history, and its consequences reached far beyond the story itself. The sheer scale of the undertaking is worth appreciating on its own terms. Nearly every ongoing DC title at the time was asked to tie into the event in some fashion, coordinating storylines across dozens of separate comics to build toward a single, unified climax. For a medium accustomed to individual titles operating largely independently of one another, this level of coordinated, universe-wide storytelling represented a genuine logistical achievement, one that set a template other publishers would spend years trying to replicate. Readers who lived through the event's original release often describe a particular, singular excitement in watching familiar characters they had followed for years suddenly appear side by side, with heroes and villains from corners of the DC universe they had never previously encountered, all working toward the same desperate, escalating goal of simply ensuring reality itself survived to see another day. By the end of Crisis, the multiple parallel Earths that had defined DC's continuity for decades were folded together into a single, unified universe. Characters who had once existed as separate versions on separate Earths were merged into single, definitive versions of themselves. The Justice Society, once confined to their own parallel world, now shared history with the Justice League as an earlier generation within the very same universe, rather than a parallel echo of it. For the Justice League specifically, This meant the team's own origin and history were, to varying degrees, rewritten and streamlined going forward. Some stories that had once been considered part of the league's official history were quietly set aside or reinterpreted. It's worth being honest here. Exactly how much of the pre-crisis Justice League history remained canon after this event is something even longtime fans and DC's own writers have debated and handled inconsistently over the years. So rather than presenting any single version as absolute fact, it's fairer to say that Crisis marked a genuine before and after point in the team's history, a line after which the League's world looked simpler, but also somewhat different than it had before. There was a genuine sense of loss among longtime readers as Crisis unfolded, and it's worth acknowledging that honestly rather than glossing over it. Some fans grieved the streamlined multiverse, missing the nostalgic charm of stories that could freely hop between different Earths and different versions of familiar characters. Others welcomed the clarity, relieved to finally have a single, coherent timeline they could follow without needing decades of prior reading to fully understand. Both reactions capture something true about what Crisis accomplished. It gained accessibility and clarity, and it gave up a certain kind of sprawling, layered richness that had, for better or worse, defined DC's storytelling for a generation. For the Justice League's own internal history, this meant that many of the specific adventures we've already discussed, the classic era, the team changes of the late 1960s, even much of the satellite era, existed afterward in a kind of narrative gray area, generally still considered to have happened in broad strokes, but no longer treated as precisely, rigidly canonical the way they once had been. This is a pattern worth remembering as we continue, because DC would return to this same basic maneuver, simplifying continuity through a massive crossover event, more than once in the decades ahead. Crisis on Infinite Earths is also remembered, quite significantly, for the real emotional weight of its story, not just its structural consequences for DC's continuity. Along the way, several long-standing heroes lost their lives in the fight against the Anti-Monitor, most notably Supergirl and the Silver Age Flash, Barry Allen himself, both dying in acts of genuine, story-altering sacrifice rather than being sidelined through some more convenient narrative device. Barry Allen's death in particular sent ripples through the DC universe for years afterward, eventually leading his former sidekick, Wally West, to take up the mantle of the Flash and carry the identity forward for an entire generation of readers who had grown up without ever knowing DC's universe with any other Flash at its center. These weren't losses treated lightly. They were framed, deliberately, as the genuine cost of the sacrifice required to save existence itself, a reminder that even a story primarily concerned with reorganizing decades of continuity could still find room for real, lasting grief. The years that followed Crisis gave DC's writers a chance to relaunch and reintroduce many of their characters for a new generation of readers, Superman and Wonder Woman most notably among them, receiving fresh origin stories built for the post-Crisis universe. The Justice League itself would soon undergo one of its most significant reinventions yet, trading the cosmic grandeur of the satellite era for something considerably more human in scale and considerably funnier. Chapter 8: The Justice League International Era. In the years immediately following Crisis on Infinite Earths, writers Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis, along with artists Kevin Maguire and others, took the Justice League in a direction few readers had anticipated. Rather than continuing with the cosmic, larger-than-life tone of the satellite era, they reimagined the team as something closer to a workplace comedy layered on top of a superhero adventure, without ever losing sight of genuine stakes when the story called for them. This creative pivot arrived at a particularly opportune moment for DC. In the immediate aftermath of Crisis on Infinite Earths, with so many characters undergoing fresh origin stories and fresh interpretations, the publisher had unusual freedom to experiment with tone and format in ways that might have felt jarring during a more settled period of continuity. Giffen and DeMatteis took full advantage of that freedom, crafting a Justice League unlike anything readers had seen before, one willing to lean fully into comedic timing and character-driven banter, without ever undermining the genuine danger of the threats the team faced. The approach proved to be exactly what readers were ready for, arriving at a moment when superhero comics more broadly were beginning to explore a wider range of tones than the relatively narrow band of straightforward heroism that had dominated much of the medium's earlier decades. Much of this shift came down to roster, with Superman and Wonder Woman largely occupied elsewhere in DC's post-crisis publishing plans. The new Justice League leaned on a very different lineup. Batman remained, now serving as a leader trying, often with visible exasperation, to keep a much less experienced and considerably less disciplined team in line. Blue Beetle, Ted Kord, brought a wisecracking, technology-driven brand of heroism paired with genuine warmth. Booster Gold, a hero from the future motivated as much by fame and fortune as by altruism, provided both comic relief and, over time, surprising emotional depth. Guy Gardner, one of Hal Jordan's fellow Green Lanterns, became infamous during this era for his abrasive, often obnoxious personality, providing a near-constant source of friction and humor within the team. Martian Manhunter, Fire, and Ice rounded out much of this new lineup, with Fire and Ice in particular offering a friendship dynamic, warm and often funny, that helped ground the team's more comedic elements in genuine character connection. This version of the team also increasingly embraced its international branding in a very literal sense, establishing embassies and satellite offices in various countries around the world, positioning the League not just as protectors of any one nation, but as a globally minded organization. Fire and Ice, Beatriz da Costa and Tora Olafsdotter, brought something the team hadn't quite had before: a close, easy friendship between two women that didn't revolve around rivalry or romance, simply two very different personalities, one bold and outgoing, the other quieter and more reserved, who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. That dynamic gave the book warmth in its quieter moments, a reminder that even amid alien invasions and interdimensional threats, the heart of the story often came down to small, human connections between teammates who had come to think of each other as family. Martian Manhunter's role during this era shifted as well, from the somewhat more peripheral position he'd occupied in earlier decades into something closer to the team's quiet emotional center, the patient, steady presence capable of grounding a roster built largely from more chaotic personalities. His long history of loss and isolation gave him a particular sensitivity to the found family dynamic this era leaned into so heavily, and longtime readers often point to this period as one where J'onn J'onzz finally received the depth and attention his character had always deserved. What made this era so beloved, and it remains one of the most fondly remembered periods in the team's entire history among longtime fans, was the way it balanced genuine humor with real heart. The banter between characters felt natural rather than forced. The team's dysfunction, Batman's short patience, Guy Gardner's ego, Booster Gold's self-interest slowly softening into real heroism, gave the book a personality unlike anything the League had done before. And when serious threats did arise, the stories didn't shy away from real consequence, allowing the humor and the danger to coexist rather than undercutting one another. Part of what made this dynamic work so well was the specific chemistry between characters who, on paper, seemed like an unlikely combination. Batman leading a team largely made up of B-list and C-list heroes rather than his usual roster of cosmic powerhouses forced the Dark Knight into a role he rarely occupied elsewhere. The exasperated, world-weary adult in the room, constantly reeling in a group of well-meaning but chaotic teammates. Readers responded strongly to seeing one of DC's most serious characters placed in a setting that let his dry, cutting sense of humor shine through. A side of Batman not always given room to breathe in his own, more consistently grim solo stories. Booster Gold's arc across this era deserves particular attention, since it represents one of the more quietly effective character journeys in the team's history. Introduced as a hero motivated largely by self-interest, someone who had traveled back in time specifically hoping to become rich and famous through heroism, Booster gradually, issue by issue, revealed a genuine heart beneath the showmanship, particularly through his deepening friendship with Blue Beetle. That friendship, warm, funny, and eventually deeply moving, became one of the emotional anchors of the entire era, and it's still remembered fondly by longtime readers decades later. Guy Gardner, meanwhile, served a somewhat different narrative purpose. His abrasive, often genuinely unlikable behavior gave the team an internal source of conflict that didn't require an external villain, and while later stories would work to humanize him further, during this era, he mostly functioned as a reminder that not every Green Lantern shared Hal Jordan's more measured heroism. Guy's presence kept the team's internal dynamic from ever feeling too comfortable or too predictable. Blue Beetle deserves his own moment of attention here as well, since Ted Kord's particular brand of heroism, resourceful, self-deprecating, entirely dependent on gadgets and wit rather than any inherent superpower, made him something of an everyman figure amid a roster that otherwise leaned heavily on cosmic abilities and alien technology. His friendship with Booster Gold gave the book its emotional through-line, but Ted's own individual voice, endlessly quipping even in genuinely dangerous situations, gave the series much of its distinctive comedic rhythm. Longtime readers often point to the Kord-Gold dynamic as one of the finest depictions of platonic male friendship in mainstream superhero comics, a bond built on genuine affection expressed almost entirely through relentless, affectionate ribbing. The decision to embrace the international branding also reflected a broader shift in how DC's editorial team thought about the League's place in the world. Establishing embassies in various countries wasn't simply a cosmetic detail. It represented a genuine attempt to move the team's operations beyond an implicitly American-centered headquarters, acknowledging that a team meant to protect the entire planet ought to have some meaningful presence beyond the borders of any single nation. Whether or not every individual story fully lived up to that ambition, the underlying gesture mattered, an early acknowledgement that the League's mandate extended well beyond whatever country happened to house its primary headquarters. This tonal experiment proved that the Justice League could work as something other than a purely cosmic, deadly serious institution. It could also be a found family of imperfect, sometimes ridiculous people who happened to save the world together, bickering the entire way. That flexibility, the sense that the League's tone could shift dramatically depending on who was writing it and who made up its roster, would become one of the defining traits of the team going forward, visible again and again in the decades that followed. The lasting influence of this particular era on the broader superhero genre is genuinely difficult to overstate. Long after the specific roster and specific storylines of the Justice League International years had given way to newer iterations of the team, the underlying lesson that a team book could balance genuine comedic chemistry with real emotional and physical stakes without one undermining the other, continued to shape how writers across the industry approached ensemble superhero storytelling. Later creative teams working on the League itself, and on team books at other publishers entirely, would return again and again to the basic template established during these years. Give the characters room to actually enjoy each other's company. Let their friendships feel lived in and specific rather than generic, and trust that genuine warmth between characters only makes the moments of real danger land with greater impact rather than less. Chapter 9: The 1990s. The 1990s brought a period of considerable experimentation to the Justice League franchise, as DC tried out different formats, different rosters, and different tones in search of what would resonate with an industry that was itself changing rapidly during this decade. Rather than a single, unified team book, the League splintered across multiple titles during parts of this era. Justice League America and Justice League Europe ran concurrently for a time, each following different rosters operating out of different regional headquarters, allowing DC to feature a much larger pool of characters simultaneously than any single ongoing series could have managed. The European branch, in particular, leaned into some of the same international flavor established during the Giffen de Matteis years, while introducing newer or lesser-used characters a broader spotlight. This regional split allowed for an interesting kind of storytelling contrast, with the American branch often handling threats closer to the team's traditional cosmic and metahuman territory, while the European branch occasionally leaned into subtler, more geopolitically inflected stories reflecting its different setting and different cast. Neither branch was considered more authentic than the other within the ongoing narrative, a detail that mattered given the League's long-standing commitment, dating back to the international embassies of the Justice League International era, to positioning itself as a genuinely global institution rather than one centered entirely around any single country's heroes or concerns. This period also saw the team's tone shift once again, moving gradually away from the comedic sensibility of the late 1980s towards something a bit more action-driven, in keeping with broader trends across the comics industry during the decade. Storylines grew more sprawling, occasionally tying into some of DC's larger universe-wide crossover events, and the roster continued to rotate through an unusually wide array of characters, some of them mainstays returning to the fold, others newer additions testing whether they belonged among the League's ranks. One of the more significant developments during this decade came from a different angle entirely. Rather than another version of the adult Justice League, DC introduced Young Justice, a team of teenage heroes including Robin, Superboy, and Impulse, among others, offering a lighter, younger-skewing counterpart to the increasingly complex adult team books. While not the Justice League itself, Young Justice reflected DC's ongoing interest in exploring what team-based superhero storytelling could look like from different angles and for different audiences, an approach that would echo forward into later eras of the franchise. This younger team carried a particular significance beyond its own entertaining stories, since it established, more explicitly than almost anything before it, the idea of the Justice League as a kind of aspirational institution, a team that younger heroes might one day earn their way into, provided they proved themselves capable of the judgment and sacrifice membership required. Several members of Young Justice would, in the years and different continuities that followed, go on to join the adult Justice League itself, turning what began as a lighter, spin-off concept into genuine training ground for the team's future. This era also saw the League cross paths repeatedly with some of DC's largest company-wide crossover events, stories that spanned nearly every ongoing title the publisher produced at the time. While these massive crossovers gave the team opportunities to interact with heroes far outside their usual roster, they also meant that individual Justice League titles sometimes felt like small pieces of a much larger publishing puzzle, rather than self-contained stories with their own clear beginning, middle, and end. Longtime readers of the team often look back on this particular stretch with mixed feelings, appreciating the ambition and scale of these events, while also acknowledging that the league's own distinct identity occasionally got lost amid so much simultaneous continuity. The membership roles during this decade grew to include an unusually wide range of characters cycling in and out, some staying for years, and becoming genuinely beloved parts of the team's ongoing story, others passing through more briefly before moving on to other corners of DC's expansive publishing line. This constant churn made the 1990s Justice League feel, at times, less like a single defined team and more like a revolving door of Earth's available heroes, gathered together whenever the current crisis demanded a large enough response. For readers trying to follow a consistent core cast the way earlier eras had offered, this could be disorienting. But for readers who enjoyed simply seeing as many different heroes as possible sharing a page together, it offered a kind of sprawling abundance the more tightly curated eras before and after rarely matched. By the decade's end, DC's editorial team had come to recognize that the league's fragmented, multi-title approach, while allowing for an impressively large ensemble cast, had also diluted some of what made the team special in earlier eras. The sense of an elite, tightly focused group of the world's very best heroes, working together specifically because each of them brought something no one else on the team could offer. There were bright spots throughout the decade as well, moments where individual writers found ways to give specific incarnations of the team real focus and heart, despite the broader fragmentation. Various creative teams experimented with smaller, tighter rosters within the larger Justice League America and Justice League Europe framework, occasionally recapturing some of the character-driven charm that had defined the Giffen DeMatteis years. But by and large, this period is remembered less for any single definitive era and more as a decade of searching, DC trying out format after format, roster after roster, looking for whatever version of the team would resonate most strongly with readers heading into a new millennium. This searching quality extended to the team's dynamic with the broader DC universe as well. The 1990s were a decade of significant upheaval across DC's line more generally, with major status quo shifts affecting characters like Superman and Batman, rippling outward into how the League itself was portrayed and structured. A team book, by its very nature, has to remain responsive to whatever changes are happening within its members' individual titles, and the sheer volume of significant developments happening simultaneously across DC's line during this decade meant the Justice League often found itself reacting to circumstances established elsewhere, rather than driving its own independent narrative direction, the way it had during more stable, self-contained eras like the Satellite years. That recognition would set the stage for one of the most significant and influential reinventions in the team's entire history, one built around returning to the League's most iconic possible lineup. Chapter 10: JLA and the Modernization of the Team. In 1996, writer Grant Morrison, alongside artist Howard Porter, relaunched the team under the simplified title JLA, and in doing so, delivered what many fans and critics still regard as one of the defining eras in the Justice League's entire publication history. Morrison arrived at this project with a clearly articulated philosophy about what had gone wrong with the League during the fragmented, multi-title approach of the preceding years, and what needed to change to restore the team's sense of mythic importance. Rather than treating the roster as an ever-expanding opportunity to showcase as many characters as possible, Morrison approached the League the way a mythographer might approach a pantheon, insisting that the team's power came specifically from a small, tightly curated group of figures whose individual mythologies were significant enough to justify near-constant cosmic-scale storytelling. This was, in its own way, a return to the confidence and clarity of the team's earliest Silver Age appearances, translated through a considerably more sophisticated, more self-aware sensibility suited to readers of the 1990s. Morrison's approach was, in a sense, a deliberate return to first principles. Rather than continuing with the sprawling, multi-branch rosters of the 1990s, JLA pulled the focus back to what Morrison and DC's editorial team considered the League's 7 most iconic members: Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, and Martian Manhunter. The same core lineup, in spirit if not always in exact individual identity, that had founded the team decades earlier. This return to an iconic, tightly focused roster came paired with storytelling on a genuinely massive scale. Morrison's run treated the League not as a group of capable heroes handling street-level crime, but as Earth's ultimate defense against threats operating on a cosmic, sometimes reality-bending level. Alien invasions, godlike villains, and universe-spanning dangers became the team's regular stock in trade, all handled with a sense of mythic grandeur that echoed, and in many ways deliberately paid tribute to, the imaginative scope of the team's earliest Silver Age adventures. At the same time, Morrison's writing brought a distinctly modern sensibility to how these iconic characters were portrayed, treating them less as static symbols and more as fully realized personalities navigating what it meant to be, quite literally, some of the most powerful beings on the planet. The stories asked pointed questions about trust, about how the League's near-godlike members related to ordinary humanity, and about the immense responsibility that came with wielding that kind of power. This era proved enormously influential, both within DC's own subsequent storytelling and across the broader landscape of team-based superhero comics. It reestablished, clearly and confidently, the idea that the Justice League worked best not as an ever-expanding roster of every hero DC had available, but as a focused, elite team built around its most recognizable and most narratively resonant members. Later writers who took over the JLA title continued building on this foundation throughout the early 2000s, maintaining the sense of scale and ambition Morrison had established, while adding their own storytelling voices to the team's ongoing history. The success of this modernized, iconic lineup approach set the template that most subsequent versions of the Justice League, across comics, animation, and eventually film, would return to again and again. 7 heroes, each representing something different, each essential, coming together specifically because the world occasionally needed exactly that combination of strength, mind, heart, and will. One of the more memorable qualities of this era was Morrison's willingness to treat each founding member's power set with a kind of reverence, exploring exactly how far each hero's abilities could theoretically extend when pushed to their absolute limits. Superman's power was framed not just as strength and flight, but as something closer to a genuinely godlike presence bound by voluntary restraint. Batman was reframed as a tactical genius capable of outthinking opponents who possessed powers he could never hope to match, always carrying contingency plans for nearly any scenario imaginable, including controversially in later stories, contingency plans for his own teammates should they ever be compromised. Wonder Woman's warrior heritage was given fuller expression, positioning her as one of the team's most formidable combatants rather than simply its most diplomatically minded member. This willingness to take each character's mythology fully seriously, rather than softening any of them for the sake of team balance, gave the era a sense of scale that readers found genuinely thrilling. The League wasn't just powerful. It was, in Morrison's telling, close to the absolute ceiling of what superhero storytelling could imagine. A group capable of standing against literally anything the universe could produce, bound together not by necessity, but by genuine, hard-earned trust in one another's judgment and character. The Flash and Green Lantern, too, received this same treatment during the era, each reframed as far more essential to the team's success than their relatively grounded powers might initially suggest. The Flash's connection to the Speed Force, the mysterious, near-mystical energy source underlying all superspeed abilities in the DC universe, was explored with newfound depth, positioning him as capable of solving problems on a scale that rivaled his more overtly powerful teammates, simply by moving fast enough to outrun causality itself in the story's most dramatic moments. Green Lantern's willpower-based ring, similarly, was portrayed as effectively limited only by imagination, capable of manifesting constructs and solutions no other hero on the team could conceive of, turning Hal Jordan, or whichever Green Lantern currently held the ring, into one of the team's most creative and unpredictable problem solvers. Aquaman and Martian Manhunter also benefited from this era's willingness to dig deeper into underexplored corners of their mythology. Aquaman's command of Atlantis and the wider oceanic world was given room to breathe as a genuine geopolitical force within the DC universe, rather than a novelty power set, while Martian Manhunter's psychic abilities were portrayed with a scale and subtlety that made him, in many respects, one of the team's quiet strategic centers, capable of coordinating the team's efforts telepathically, even in the chaos of the largest battles. But even the most iconic version of the team faces threats capable of testing everything it stands for. It's worth pausing here to look more closely at some of the adversaries who, across every era we've discussed so far, have most defined what it means to challenge the Justice League. Chapter 11, Major Threats. A team is often defined as much by what it stands against as by what it stands for, and across more than 60 years of stories, a handful of adversaries have come to represent the truest measure of what it means to threaten the Justice League. There's a particular storytelling logic behind why certain villains recur across decades of a hero's history, while others fade after a single memorable appearance. The threats that endure tend to share one quality above all others. They represent a genuine philosophical opposite to whatever the hero or team stands for, rather than simply presenting a physical obstacle to overcome. A villain who merely hits harder than the heroes eventually loses its narrative power once the heroes inevitably grow strong enough to hit back just as hard. A villain who represents an entirely different worldview, one built on domination rather than cooperation, on the erasure of choice rather than its protection, can remain meaningful indefinitely, because the conflict was never really about raw strength to begin with. The threats explored in this chapter each earn their place in League history, precisely because they embody something the team's entire existence stands directly opposed to. Darkseid, ruler of the hellish planet Apocalypse, stands above nearly every other villain in the team's history in terms of sheer narrative weight. Darkseid's goal, across decades of stories, has rarely been simple conquest. He seeks the anti-life equation, a conceptual formula capable of erasing free will itself, allowing him to command all of existence not through force, but through the total removal of anyone's ability to resist him. That distinction matters enormously to why Darkseid works so well as the League's ultimate adversary. He doesn't just threaten their lives or their planet. He threatens the very idea of choice, the same value that sits at the core of who each League member chose to become. Confrontations with Darkseid have repeatedly pushed the team to its absolute limits, and his presence looming over the DC universe has shaped some of the League's most significant stories. What makes Darkseid so enduringly effective as a villain isn't simply his raw power, considerable as it is, with abilities including the devastating Omega beams, twin blasts of energy capable of tracking their targets across nearly any distance and disintegrating or teleporting whatever they strike. It's the patience behind his menace. Darkseid rarely rushes. He is a being who has existed for ages beyond ordinary reckoning, willing to let plans unfold across decades if necessary, which makes him uniquely suited to serve as a recurring, generational threat. Rather than a villain, the League simply defeats once and moves past. Nearly every major era discussed in this history, from the satellite years through the JLA period, and into the team's most recent stories, has found some reason to bring Darkseid back into the narrative, each time finding a new angle on why his particular brand of tyranny remains uniquely terrifying. Apokolips itself, Darkseid's home world, deserves mention as well, since the planet functions almost as an extension of its ruler's philosophy made physical. A world of fire pits, oppressive industry, and a population ground down into obedient service, Apokolips stands as the visual and thematic opposite of everything the Justice League represents. A society built entirely around the erasure of individual will rather than its protection. Whenever League stories venture into Apokolips itself, rather than simply facing Darkseid's forces on Earth, the stakes take on an additional dimension, forcing the heroes to confront not just a single tyrant, but an entire civilization built in service of his particular vision of order through total submission. Brainiac, a coldly logical, endlessly evolving artificial intelligence obsessed with collecting knowledge, represents a very different kind of threat, one built on precision and inevitability rather than raw power. Brainiac's history is deeply tied to Superman in particular, given the villain's association with the destruction and miniaturization of cities, including, in various versions of the story, cities connected to Superman's own Kryptonian heritage. When Brainiac turns his attention to the League as a whole, the danger lies less in brute force and more in his capacity to calculate his way around nearly any defense the team can offer. Brainiac's particular menace comes from the sense that he is always several steps ahead, a villain whose intelligence renders most conventional heroics irrelevant. Where a villain like Darkseid can be met, at least in theory, with equal and opposite force, Brainiac requires the League to outthink rather than simply outfight him, and stories built around his schemes have often forced the team's more analytically minded members, Batman especially, into the spotlight, relying on strategy and preparation rather than raw power to close the gap. Brainiac's calculations always seem to keep just out of reach. Starro, an enormous, telepathic, star-shaped alien entity, holds a special place in the League's history as the very first villain the founding team ever faced together, back in their debut story. Starro's power to control minds through small parasitic offshoots that attach to victims' faces has made the character a recurring, oddly unsettling threat across decades of stories, memorable as much for its strange visual design as for the genuine menace of losing one's free will to a hive-mind alien intelligence. There is something fitting, looking back across the entire history covered in this account, about the fact that the League's very first adversary was a creature built around the loss of individual will. Long before Darkseid's anti-life equation, long before the crime syndicate's twisted mirror of heroism, the team's earliest story already understood, even if only instinctively, that the deepest threats to a group built on individual choice and cooperation would always be threats aimed at erasing that choice altogether. Starro set a template, whether its original creators fully intended it or not, that the League's greatest stories would return to again and again in the decades that followed. The crime syndicate represents a different kind of danger entirely, not an alien invader or an ancient god, but a dark mirror. Hailing from a parallel Earth where morality itself runs inverted, the crime syndicate consists of twisted, villainous counterparts to the League's own members, heroes turned monstrous when placed in a world without the same values. Facing the crime syndicate forces the League to confront uncomfortable questions about how much of their heroism comes from choice, and how much might simply be circumstance. Characters like Ultraman, the Syndicate's corrupted counterpart to Superman, or Owlman, its considerably darker echo of Batman, work precisely because they aren't simply evil versions of good characters for shock value. Each one represents a genuine exploration of what these particular heroes might have become under different circumstances, raised in a world where cruelty was rewarded rather than restrained. Encountering them forces the League's actual members into uncomfortable, quiet moments of self-reflection, wondering how much of their own heroism came from deliberate choice, and how much simply came from having been raised, guided, or shaped by people who happened to instill the right values at the right moment. Amazo, an android built with the ability to duplicate the powers of any hero it encounters, poses a particularly personal threat to the League specifically, given that its abilities only grow more dangerous the more of the team's own members it fights. Amazo essentially transforms the League's greatest strength, its diversity of powers, into a weapon against them. There's a particular irony worth sitting with in Amazo's design, one that speaks directly to something we've discussed throughout this history. The entire premise of the Justice League rests on the idea that combining different powers and different perspectives makes the team stronger than any individual hero alone. Amazo inverts that premise entirely, using the very same principle of combined strength against the people who first proved it worked. Facing him forces the League into a genuinely difficult tactical position, since the conventional wisdom of bring everyone available actually works against them, the moment Amazo has already copied enough of their abilities to match the team blow for blow. The Anti-Monitor, the entity responsible for the events of crisis on infinite Earths, represents perhaps the single most cosmically destructive threat the League and the wider DC universe have ever faced, a being capable of erasing entire parallel worlds from existence. While not exclusively a Justice League villain, his role in reshaping DC's continuity makes him impossible to leave out of any honest account of the team's history. What makes the Anti-Monitor distinct from every other threat discussed in this chapter is scale bordering on the incomprehensible. Darkseid threatens free will. Brainiac threatens cities and civilizations. The Anti-Monitor threatens the literal existence of entire universes, an antagonist whose power operates on a scale that even the League's most powerful members can only meaningfully oppose when standing alongside dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other heroes drawn from across the whole of DC's fictional multiverse. His presence in this history is a reminder that for all the personal, character-driven stakes explored across decades of Justice League storytelling, the team has also, on occasion, found itself standing at the very edge of existence itself, the last and only thing standing between reality and total erasure. Finally, the Legion of Doom, a recurring antagonist organization uniting many of the League's individual villains, most notably Lex Luthor, under a single banner, offers something closer to a dark reflection of the League itself. The idea that just as heroes are stronger together, so too are the villains who oppose them. Beyond Luthor's leadership, the Legion of Doom has, across various eras of its history, drawn together a rotating cast of the League's individual rogues, figures whose particular grudges and particular gifts made them dangerous alone, but genuinely formidable once organized around a shared purpose. Where the Justice League's unity comes from trust and shared values, the Legion of Doom's unity has always been more precarious, an alliance of convenience among deeply ambitious, often deeply distrustful individuals, each ultimately serving their own interests even while nominally working toward a common goal. That instability, ironically, has often proven to be exactly the weakness the League needed to exploit, since a team bound only by mutual advantage tends to fracture under exactly the kind of pressure that draws a genuinely trusting team closer together. Lex Luthor's role within this dynamic deserves particular attention, since across decades of stories, he has functioned less as a conventional supervillain and more as an ideological counterpoint to everything the League represents. Brilliant, deeply resentful of Superman's power in particular, and utterly convinced of his own superiority, Luthor has repeatedly organized other villains, funded criminal enterprises, and even, in various eras of DC continuity, held legitimate political power, using every tool available to undermine the very idea that beings like Superman deserve humanity's trust. Where Darkseid threatens the League from without, Luthor's particular danger often comes from his ability to sow doubt, using public opinion, media manipulation, and political influence as weapons every bit as effective, in their own way, as Darkseid's Omega beams. Taken together, these threats reveal something important about what the Justice League has always represented across every era of its history. The team's greatest adversaries rarely just threaten physical destruction. They threaten choice, identity, unity, and free will, the very qualities that define the League members as individuals and as a team. And it's precisely because the stakes run that deep that the League's victories, when they come, feel genuinely earned rather than simply inevitable. Chapter 12: Identity Crisis and the Darker Side of the League. By the early 2000s, superhero comics as a medium had grown increasingly comfortable exploring morally complicated territory, and the Justice League was not immune to this broader shift. Nowhere was that more apparent than in the storyline known as Identity Crisis, written by Brad Meltzer, which remains one of the most discussed and most debated chapters in the team's entire history. Without dwelling on graphic specifics, the story centers on the death of Sue Dibney, wife of longtime League member Elongated Man, and the investigation that follows among the extended Justice League family as they try to determine who was responsible. What makes the story genuinely significant to the team's larger history isn't the mystery itself, but the uncomfortable revelations it surfaces about decisions certain League members made years earlier, choices involving memory manipulation used against some of their own adversaries, made without the full team's knowledge or consent. Sue Dibney's role within this story carries particular weight precisely because of everything established about her character during the Satellite era, discussed earlier in this history. She had long represented something the League rarely got to show: an ordinary, beloved civilian woven directly into the fabric of the team's extended family, proof that these extraordinary heroes maintained genuine, loving connections to people without powers of their own. Her death and the subsequent unraveling of secrets it triggered hit with a particular force specifically, because readers had spent years understanding her as beloved rather than peripheral. A reminder that the story's emotional stakes were built on real, accumulated history, rather than a character introduced merely to be removed. The story forced both the characters and the readers to sit with difficult questions that earlier eras of Justice League storytelling had rarely engaged with so directly. What does it mean when heroes, acting from genuinely protective instincts, cross ethical lines in secret? What happens to trust within a team built explicitly on the idea of shared purpose and mutual accountability, when some members learn that others kept dangerous secrets from them? Identity Crisis didn't offer easy answers to these questions, and that discomfort was, in many ways, precisely the point. This story arrived within a broader trend across DC's line during this period, one where classic characters and classic teams were increasingly asked to grapple with consequence, moral compromise, and the psychological toll of a life spent fighting for others. Some longtime fans embraced this shift as a sign of genuine narrative maturity, a willingness to treat these long-running characters as complex people rather than static icons. Others felt it risked undermining the hopeful, aspirational quality that had defined the League since its earliest Silver Age adventures. This broader trend wasn't unique to DC or to the Justice League specifically. Across the superhero comics industry during the early 2000s, publishers were increasingly experimenting with morally complicated storytelling aimed at an audience of readers who had, in many cases, grown up alongside these characters and were now looking for stories that matched their own more mature, more complicated understanding of the world. The challenge facing any writer working within this trend was significant. How do you introduce genuine moral weight and consequence into stories about characters explicitly designed, decades earlier, to represent uncomplicated ideals like truth, justice, and hope, without undermining the very qualities that made those characters worth following in the first place? Identity Crisis represents one particular, deliberately provocative answer to that question, an answer that continues to divide opinion among longtime readers even now, years after its original publication. Both reactions capture something true about this era. The Justice League's core identity, 7 heroes with different strengths uniting for the greater good, remained fundamentally intact. But the stories being told about that team had grown willing to ask what happens when that unity is tested from within, not just by external villains, but by the weight of secrets, judgment calls, and the genuine difficulty of doing the right thing when the right thing isn't always clear. It's also worth noting how this story rippled outward into the broader Justice League family beyond the core team itself, touching characters connected to the League through marriage, friendship, and years of shared history, rather than active membership alone. That ripple effect underscored something the story was trying to say about the nature of secrets within any close community. That consequences rarely stay contained to only the people directly involved, and that trust, once broken, tends to affect far more relationships than the ones at the center of the original decision. Looking back on this story now, with the benefit of years of subsequent Justice League history to compare it against, it stands as a clear turning point, a moment where the franchise deliberately chose to let its heroes be flawed, sometimes badly so, rather than treating them as untouchable symbols beyond genuine moral scrutiny. Whatever a given reader ultimately feels about that creative choice, its influence on how the League was written in the years that followed is difficult to overstate. It's worth noting, too, that this era wasn't only about internal fracture. Alongside these harder, more morally complicated stories, the broader Justice League family of titles during the early 2000s also produced some of the franchise's most heartfelt explorations of found family and mentorship, as older members increasingly took on the role of guiding younger heroes toward eventual membership. The tension between these two threads, growing moral complexity on one hand and continued emphasis on legacy and trust on the other, gave this period of the League's history a genuinely layered emotional texture, neither purely dark nor purely hopeful, but honestly reflective of an institution old enough to have accumulated both hard-won wisdom and real regret. This willingness to sit with moral complexity would carry forward into the next major turning point in the League's history, one that would once again reshape the entire DC universe around them. Take a moment here, if you're still listening, to simply breathe. We've traveled through several decades of history already tonight, from bright, hopeful beginnings through some genuinely difficult, morally tangled territory. It's all right to let the weight of a story like Identity Crisis settle for a moment before we move forward. Picture, if it helps, the Watchtower's quietest room, the one few members ever mention in the comics themselves, but which surely must exist somewhere within it. A small observation deck, windows facing out toward open space, a single chair, a place any of them might go simply to sit, to think, to let the enormity of what they carry settle into something bearable before returning to the rest of the team. Even heroes need somewhere quiet to process difficult things. Perhaps tonight, this is yours. Chapter 13, Infinite Crisis. 2 decades after the original Crisis on Infinite Earths had simplified DC's continuity into a single unified universe, cracks began to show once again. Years of stories, retcons, and creative decisions made by many different writers had gradually complicated that once clean continuity. And by the mid-2000s, DC's editorial team decided the time had come for another universe-altering event, one that would deliberately echo and directly reference the original Crisis that inspired it. This decision reflected a pattern that, by this point in our history, should feel genuinely familiar. DC's ongoing, decades-long relationship with its own accumulated continuity, forever oscillating between the desire to preserve everything that had come before and the practical need to occasionally simplify things for the benefit of new and long-time readers alike. Unlike the original Crisis, however, which arrived as a genuine surprise to readers unfamiliar with the scale of what DC intended, Infinite Crisis arrived with readers already primed to expect exactly this kind of event. A reflection of how thoroughly the original Crisis had reshaped not just DC's continuity, but the broader cultural expectations around what a major superhero comics event could and should accomplish. Infinite Crisis, published in 2005, functioned as both a sequel to and a meditation on the original Crisis on Infinite Earths. Without wading too deeply into plot specifics that vary depending on which tie-in issues a reader followed, the broad strokes involve surviving characters from the pre-Crisis multiverse, most notably an alternate version of Superman from the old Earth 2, growing disillusioned with how the modern, post-Crisis DC universe had turned out. Where the original Crisis had been framed as an unambiguous act of heroism, saving all of reality from total annihilation, Infinite Crisis complicated that legacy, suggesting that the perfect, unified universe those heroes had fought to preserve had, in the eyes of some who remembered what came before, grown darker and more morally compromised than the one they'd sacrificed to protect. For the Justice League specifically, Infinite Crisis carried significant consequences. The story explored real tension and fracture within the team, touching on the fallout from Identity Crisis and other morally complicated stories of the preceding years, and ultimately led to a period where the league's core membership and structure were reevaluated and rebuilt. Following the event, a new team formed under the banner of simply Justice League, featuring a roster deliberately built around trust, rebuilt from the ground up, drawing heavily again on the seven-member iconic lineup that had proven so successful during the JLA era. There's a particular emotional resonance in how this story chose to frame its central conflict, using a figure from the League's own idealized past to critique what the present had become. It's a device worth pausing on, because it captures something genuinely poignant about long-running fiction more broadly: the discomfort of holding up a beloved, simpler version of a story against the more complicated, harder-won version that time and consequence inevitably produce. The alternate Superman at the heart of Infinite Crisis wasn't simply a villain to be defeated. He represented a kind of grief, a mourning for a version of heroism that felt cleaner, less burdened by compromise, even if that cleanliness had perhaps never been entirely real to begin with. The League's actual response to this challenge, choosing to rebuild trust honestly rather than retreat into easier, less complicated ideals, said something important about the team's maturity by this point in its history. Beyond its direct impact on the team's roster, Infinite Crisis also reshaped elements of DC's broader multiverse once again, reintroducing the concept of parallel Earths in a more structured, deliberately organized form than had existed prior to the original Crisis, a decision that would continue to influence DC's storytelling in the years that followed. As with the original Crisis, it's worth being honest that exactly how Infinite Crisis's continuity changes were applied varied somewhat depending on the title and the writer handling it in the years immediately following. What matters most for our purposes is the through line. DC's writers and editors, roughly every couple of decades, have returned to this same fundamental exercise, using a crisis-scale event to simplify, clarify, or intentionally complicate the shared universe the Justice League calls home. And each time, the League itself has been reshaped in the process, its membership and its outlook shifting to reflect whatever version of the DC universe currently surrounds it. This period also saw significant changes ripple through the wider Justice League family of titles, as DC used the aftermath of Infinite Crisis to launch several new ongoing series exploring different corners of the team's extended world, including books following younger heroes training to one day earn a place among the League's ranks, and titles exploring the team's history through the lens of legacy and succession. This expansion reflected a broader truth that had been building across the team's entire publication history. The Justice League was no longer simply seven heroes and their occasional guest stars. It had become an entire ecosystem, a multi-generational institution with its own mentorship structures, its own traditions, and its own sense of what it meant to eventually be trusted with membership. The team's story was about to grow even larger in scope, as the looming presence of Darkseid returned to threaten not just Earth, but the very concept of free will across all of existence. Before we go there, imagine the satellite, or the watchtower, or whatever headquarters the League happens to call home in whichever era you picture most clearly, settling into one of its rare quiet stretches, a lull between crises. Somewhere in the story, though we don't dwell on it in the history itself, there must be evenings like this. No alarms, no urgent calls, just a team of extraordinary people doing something as small as sharing a meal together, trading easy conversation, watching the Earth turn slowly beneath them through a wide observation window, content for a while simply to exist alongside one another without needing to save anything. Those moments rarely make it into the biggest storylines. But they're there, quietly, underneath everything else. the actual texture of what it means to be part of a family built from cosmic responsibility. Chapter 14: Final Crisis and the Cosmic Justice League. In 2008, Grant Morrison returned to the DC Universe's largest stage with Final Crisis, a story that pushed the Justice League's mythology to some of its most cosmic and conceptually ambitious extremes yet. Where Infinite Crisis had largely concerned itself with continuity and the emotional legacy of DC's earlier universe-altering events, Final Crisis concerned itself with something even larger: the literal death of gods, and the possibility that evil itself might finally, permanently, win. At the center of the story stood Darkseid once again, this time pursuing his goal of universal domination through the anti-life equation with more direct, catastrophic success than in almost any prior appearance. The story depicted Darkseid's influence spreading across Earth in the form of the anti-life equation being broadcast and weaponized on a massive scale, stripping away free will from ordinary people in ways that felt genuinely apocalyptic rather than abstract. The Justice League's role within this story was, fittingly, to stand as Earth's final line of defense against a threat operating on a scale beyond anything the team had faced even in its most cosmic Silver Age adventures. Various League members found themselves scattered, transformed, or otherwise removed from the fight at different points in the story, forcing the narrative to draw on an unusually wide cast of DC heroes beyond the League's core roster to help carry the fight against Darkseid's forces. Batman's own arc within Final Crisis carried particular significance, given the character's direct, personal confrontation with Darkseid at the story's climax, an encounter with consequences that rippled outward across DC's publishing line for years afterward. Without dwelling on plot specifics that continue to be interpreted differently across various retellings, the confrontation reinforced something essential about Batman's place within the League's mythology. That even facing a being as ancient and overwhelming as Darkseid, the character defined entirely by human preparation rather than superhuman power refused to simply step aside, choosing instead to stand at the very center of a battle that, by any reasonable measure, should have been entirely beyond him. Final Crisis is often remembered as one of the more challenging, densely layered stories in the League's history, told through a fragmented, non-linear structure that rewarded careful, patient reading, rather than straightforward action-adventure pacing. Whatever one makes of its structure, the story's central achievement was clear. It cemented Darkseid, once again, as the League's ultimate cosmic adversary, and it reaffirmed the team's role not just as protectors of Earth, but as one of the last meaningful defenses against threats capable of unmaking free will across all of existence. In the years following Final Crisis, the League stories continued to explore this cosmic register, with Darkseid and threats of similar scale recurring across multiple subsequent arcs. The team had, by this point, firmly established itself across more than 50 years of continuity as DC's answer to the question of what happens when the stakes grow too large for any single hero, no matter how powerful, to face alone. There's a quiet paradox worth noting about stories on this scale, one that recurs throughout the League's history whenever a threat grows large enough to touch all of reality at once. The bigger the danger, the more the story tends to circle back to something intimate. A single act of will, a single refusal to give up, a single choice made by one exhausted hero standing between everything and nothing. Final Crisis, for all its cosmic scope, its parade of dying new gods and reality-bending stakes, ultimately hinged on exactly that kind of small human moment, repeated by hero after hero across the DC universe, each one choosing, in their own quiet way, not to let go. One detail from this story worth sitting with, in keeping with the reflective, unhurried spirit of this history, is how Final Crisis chose to depict Darkseid's ultimate defeat, not through a conventional battle of overwhelming force, but through something closer to a final, desperate act of resistance from Earth's protectors, refusing, even in their most exhausted and depleted state, to accept that Darkseid's vision of a world without free will could be allowed to stand. That refusal, more than any single punch thrown or power displayed, captured something essential about what the Justice League has always been at its core. Not simply the most powerful heroes on Earth, but the ones who refuse to stop trying, no matter how impossible the odds appear. But even the most cosmic team in comics was about to face a very different kind of challenge, this time originating not from a villain, but from DC's own publishing decisions. Chapter 15, The New 52. In 2011, DC Comics made one of the most sweeping publishing decisions in its history, canceling its entire line of ongoing titles and relaunching everything simultaneously under a single banner, The New 52. Every book restarted at issue number 1, and every character's history was, to varying degrees, reset or reimagined for a new generation of readers, an approach considerably more drastic than either of the previous Crisis events had attempted. The decision came at a moment of genuine anxiety within the comic book industry more broadly, as publishers grappled with declining sales, an aging readership, and the challenge of making decades-old characters feel accessible to newcomers who had no interest in first tracking down 50 years of continuity before picking up a single issue. The New 52 represented DC's most aggressive answer to that challenge, a bet that a clean, simplified starting point, paired with renumbered issue ones across the entire publishing line, would draw in readers who had previously found the company's continuity too dense or too intimidating to approach. Justice League, written by Geoff Johns with art by Jim Lee, served as the flagship title for this entire relaunch, and quite deliberately so. Rather than picking up an established team already years into its history, the story went back to the very beginning, depicting the League's founding within this new continuity for the first time, set several years before the present day of the New 52's other titles. This new origin story reintroduced the core 7, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, and Martian Manhunter, though notably with Cyborg, previously a member of the Teen Titans, folded into the founding roster as well, a deliberate change intended to give the team a more contemporary, diverse founding lineup. The tone of this new founding story leaned into distrust and friction among the heroes far more than earlier origin tellings had, portraying a team that didn't yet know or trust one another, gradually learning to work together under pressure rather than beginning as instant allies. Fittingly, given everything discussed in this history about the characters' recurring significance to the League, the New 52's founding story once again drew on Darkseid as the catalyzing threat that first brought these heroes together, an invasion from Apokolips serving as the crucible in which a group of individually operating heroes were forced to recognize that cooperation, however uncomfortable at first, offered their best chance of protecting a world none of them could adequately defend alone. This choice reinforced, once again, just how central Darkseid's particular brand of menace has remained across every major retelling of the League's origin, regardless of which specific continuity happens to be telling the story. It's worth being clear and specific here, since this is exactly the kind of continuity distinction that matters. The New 52 version of the League's history is not a continuation of the Silver Age, Satellite Era, Justice League International, or JLA-era stories discussed earlier in this history. It's a new, self-contained continuity, sharing the broad shape and spirit of those earlier eras, the same core members, similar founding threats, similar values, but functioning as its own distinct timeline rather than a direct sequel to everything that came before. Within this new continuity, the League faced reimagined versions of many familiar threats, alongside newer villains introduced specifically for this era, and the team's roster continued to expand and shift as New 52 storytelling progressed across the early 2010s. The relaunch proved commercially successful, in no small part due to the Justice League title's prominent position at the center of DC's publishing strategy, though reactions among longtime fans were more divided, with some appreciating the fresh accessibility for new readers and others missing the accumulated history and continuity that had been set aside. Cyborg's elevation to founding member deserves particular attention, since it marked one of the more significant, lasting changes to come out of the entire New 52 initiative. Victor Stone, a talented young athlete critically injured, and then saved through a combination of his father's experimental cybernetic technology and alien science introduced during the League's founding battle, brought a fundamentally different perspective to the team than any of his new teammates. Where the others had spent years, sometimes decades, growing into their respective identities, Victor's transformation was sudden, involuntary, and deeply personal, forcing him to reckon in real time with a body and abilities he had never asked for. His presence added a distinctly modern, technologically grounded voice to the founding team, and his inclusion reflected DC's broader effort throughout the New 52 era to diversify and refresh its most visible team book for a new generation of readers. This new continuity also gave individual characters room for reinterpretation that occasionally surprised longtime readers. Wonder Woman's connection to Greek mythology, for instance, was reworked in ways that changed key details of her origin, while Superman's relationship with the Daily Planet and his civilian identity underwent adjustments meant to feel more contemporary to readers encountering these characters for the first time in decades. Batman, notably, retained more continuity than most of his teammates, given editorial decisions to preserve much of his recent publication history, even through the broader relaunch, a choice that led to some of the more noticeable inconsistencies in how strictly new the New 52 truly was from character to character. Storylines throughout this era leaned heavily on the theme of trust being built rather than assumed, a natural consequence of the decision to start the team's story over from its founding moment. Threats introduced specifically for this continuity forced the still-forming team to work out, often clumsily, sometimes with real friction, how they would function together, who would lead, and how much authority any single member should hold over the others. This slower, more deliberate approach to team cohesion gave New 52 storylines a different texture than the more settled, established camaraderie readers had grown used to during the JLA years, trading some of that earlier warmth for a grittier, more process-oriented account of exactly how trust between extraordinary individuals actually gets built. As with the crisis events before it, the New 52 would not be DC's final word on the subject. Within a few years, the publisher would once again shift direction, this time aiming not to erase the League's decades of accumulated history, but to bring much of it back. There's a certain rhythm you may have noticed by now, listening to this history unfold across so many decades and so many reinventions. Simplify, then complicate. Reset, then restore. Break trust, then slowly, patiently rebuild it. It might sound exhausting, described that way, an endless cycle without any real resting point. But there's another way to hear that same rhythm, one perhaps better suited to the quiet hour in which you're listening to this story. It sounds, if you let it, less like exhaustion and more like breathing. In and out, tension and release. A story that has lasted this long through this many changes precisely because it never insists on any single, final version of itself. It simply keeps going, the same way a tide keeps going, always returning, always slightly different than the last time, always somehow still recognizably itself. Chapter 16, DC Rebirth. In 2016, DC launched what became known as Rebirth, an initiative aimed at addressing a common complaint about the New 52 era, that in resetting so much of the publisher's history, something important, a sense of legacy, warmth, and accumulated emotional history, had been lost along the way. Rather than another full continuity reset, Rebirth positioned itself as a course correction, gradually restoring elements of pre-New 52 history that fans and writers alike had missed, while retaining some of the New 52's more successful changes and additions. For the Justice League specifically, this meant a title that once again leaned into the team's long, layered history rather than treating it as a relatively recent, blank slate institution. The Rebirth era's Justice League stories, guided initially by writers including Brian Hitch and later others, worked to reestablish a sense of the team as a mature, seasoned institution, rather than a newly formed group still learning to trust each other, restoring some of the warmth and camaraderie that had characterized earlier eras like the Satellite years and the JLA period. At the same time, the book continued to introduce new threats and new storylines rather than simply revisiting old ones, treating Rebirth as an evolution of the team's history rather than a nostalgic retreat from it. One of the more significant meta-narrative threads running through Rebirth as a whole involved the mysterious erasure of certain emotional and historical connections across the DC universe, eventually tied to the manipulations of an entity connected to Dr. Manhattan, a character imported from the Watchmen universe as part of DC's broader Rebirth storytelling. While the deepest specifics of this crossover thread extended well beyond the Justice League title itself, the underlying theme resonated strongly with what Rebirth was trying to accomplish for the League specifically, restoring a sense of continuity and emotional connection that had been quietly stripped away, and giving the team's long history room to breathe again. This era also placed renewed emphasis on legacy relationships that had been somewhat sidelined during the New 52 years, restoring long-standing family and mentorship connections that longtime readers had grown up following, connections between original hero and the successors, sidekicks, and children who had grown to carry their own version of those legacies forward. For a franchise built as heavily on the idea of generational continuity as the Justice League has always been, from the earliest Justice Society crossovers through decades of new members earning their place, restoring these threads mattered just as much as any single storyline told during this particular era. By the end of the Rebirth period, the Justice League had settled back into a version of itself that felt, to many longtime readers, more recognizably connected to the team's decades of accumulated history, while still carrying forward newer elements introduced during the New 52 years. It was, in many ways, a synthesis of everything the team had been across its many eras, rather than a rejection of any single one of them. There's something fitting about how Rebirth chose to frame its own mission statement, borrowing a phrase that would echo through much of DC's marketing for the initiative. The idea that hope itself needed to be restored to a universe that had, in the eyes of many longtime readers, grown a little too cynical, a little too fractured during the preceding years. For the Justice League specifically, an institution literally founded on the premise that hope and cooperation could overcome any threat, that framing carried particular weight. Rebuilding the team's sense of warmth and trust wasn't simply a nostalgic exercise. It was, in a sense, a return to the league's most fundamental purpose, reasserting that these characters worked best not when they were isolated, suspicious, or emotionally guarded, but when they allowed themselves to genuinely rely on one another. But DC's cosmic ambitions for the League were far from finished. A new threat, one rooted in the very metaphysical structure of reality itself, was about to arrive. Chapter 17, Dark NIGHTS, Metal and Dark NIGHTS, Death Metal. Written by Scott Snyder, Dark Knights. Metal, published in 2017, introduced one of the strangest and most conceptually ambitious threats in the Justice League's history: the Dark Multiverse, a shadow realm of nightmare alternate realities formed from fear and worst-case scenarios, existing beneath the more familiar positive multiverse that had been re-established in earlier events. The concept itself deserves a moment of explanation for listeners unfamiliar with it, since it represents one of the more genuinely inventive additions to DC's cosmology in recent decades. Where the ordinary multiverse discussed throughout this history consists of parallel Earths, each essentially a viable, complete version of reality, the Dark Multiverse was framed instead as something closer to a graveyard of unrealized nightmares, worlds that formed specifically around a single moment of failure or despair, never fully stable, never meant to persist, existing only as long as necessary to embody whatever fear had given rise to them. It was less a place in the traditional sense and more a kind of cosmic subconscious, the psychological underside of hope given physical, explorable form. At the center of this story stood a twisted vision of Batman himself, an alternate, corrupted version who had merged with the new god Barbatos, becoming a being capable of tearing open the dark multiverse and unleashing an army of nightmarish alternate Batmen, each representing a different, darker path Bruce Wayne might have taken under different circumstances. For listeners unfamiliar with this material, the core idea is easier to grasp than it might sound. Rather than facing an external alien invader, the League found itself confronting reflections of its own most trusted members' deepest fears, given form and set loose upon reality. The stakes of Metal extended well beyond a single villain. The story functioned as a meditation on fear itself, on what happens when a hero's worst possible self is allowed to take shape and act in the world, and it forced the League to grapple with genuinely unsettling territory regarding one of their own founding members, without ever losing sight of the hope and resolve that had defined the team since its earliest days. There's a particular resonance to why this story chose Batman specifically as its focal point, rather than any other member of the founding seven. Of all the League's core members, Batman has always been the one most defined by his relationship to fear, both the fear he inspires in Gotham's criminals and the fear he carries privately, born from the single worst night of his own life. A story exploring what might happen if that fear were allowed to metastasize, rather than being channeled into discipline and protection, cut directly to something that had been quietly present in the character since his earliest appearances. The Dark Multiverse's nightmare Batmen weren't simply monstrous alternate versions for shock value. Each one represented a genuine, understandable path Bruce Wayne might have taken if just one or two choices, made in the aftermath of his parents' deaths, had gone differently. Its sequel, Dark Knights, Death Metal, published a few years later, escalated the stakes even further, involving the apparent death and resurrection of core aspects of DC's reality itself, alongside the return of some of the team's most significant enduring threats. Without diving too deeply into specifics that shift depending on which tie-in material a reader follows, The broad shape of the story involved a battle for the fundamental structure of the DC multiverse, with the Justice League once again standing at the absolute center of the fight to preserve it. What makes these two stories worth including in any complete Justice League history isn't just their scale, considerable as it was, but what they represent thematically. Across decades of history, the League's greatest adversaries, Darkseid, the Anti-Monitor, the Crime Syndicate, and now the Dark Multiverse itself, have consistently threatened not just Earth's safety, but the very concepts the team was built to protect: free will, hope, identity, and the fundamental difference between choosing to become a hero and being twisted into something else entirely. Beyond Batman's own confrontation with his nightmare doubles, Metal and its sequel gave considerable attention to the rest of the founding team as well, each member forced to grapple with their own particular relationship to fear and doubt as the Dark Multiverse's influence spread. Superman's unwavering optimism was tested against creeping despair. Wonder Woman's faith in redemption was tested against enemies who seemed to offer no possibility of it. Even Green Lantern's willpower, the literal foundation of his abilities, became a battleground, since a ring powered by force of will is only ever as strong as the confidence and resolve behind it. This meant that while Batman remained the story's emotional and narrative center, the crisis ultimately became a genuine team-wide trial, each hero drawing on exactly the quality that had defined them since their earliest appearances in order to hold the line. Death Metal, in particular, leaned heavily into a celebratory, almost reverent tone toward the entirety of DC's publishing history, incorporating characters, concepts, and visual references spanning decades of continuity in ways that felt less like a conventional crisis event, and more like an extended love letter to everything the Justice League and the wider DC universe had ever been. For longtime readers who had followed the team through every era discussed in this history, from the Silver Age through the New 52 and beyond, there was something quietly moving about a story that seemed determined to honor all of it at once, treating no single era as more real or more valid than any other. There's something fitting about a story this celebratory arriving at roughly this point in the League's overall timeline, after so many decades of resets, reinventions, and crisis-scale reorganizations. Rather than treating the team's tangled, repeatedly rewritten history as a burden to be managed, Death Metal seemed to suggest the opposite, that the accumulated weight of every version of the Justice League, every roster, every headquarters, every era of tone and storytelling covered across this entire history, was itself something worth celebrating rather than simplifying away. It was, in its own strange, cosmic, reality-shattering way, a genuine act of gratitude towards 60 years of storytelling. By the conclusion of Death Metal, DC's larger multiversal structure had been meaningfully reshaped once again, setting the stage for the next chapter in the League's ongoing story. Chapter 18: Infinite Frontier and Dark Crisis. Following the events of Dark Knights, Death Metal, DC entered an era known as Infinite Frontier, which restored and expanded the multiverse concept in a more open, less restrictive form than had existed at almost any point since the original Crisis on Infinite Earths decades earlier. Rather than treating parallel Earths as a problem to be solved or simplified away, Infinite Frontier embraced the multiverse as a permanent, celebrated feature of DC's storytelling going forward, allowing many different eras and versions of the League's history to coexist as valid parts of a much larger, interconnected tapestry. This shift represented something close to a philosophical evolution in how DC approached its own decades of accumulated history. Where earlier generations of editors and writers had treated continuity primarily as a problem requiring periodic correction, something to be cleaned up and simplified, whenever it grew too tangled, Infinite Frontier suggested a more mature, more confident relationship with the past. Rather than asking which version of the Justice League's history counted as the real one, the era invited readers to hold multiple versions simultaneously, understanding each as a genuine, valid expression of the same underlying characters and the same underlying values, shaped differently by different creative teams working in different decades. This wasn't merely more forgiving continuity management. It reflected, in a sense, exactly the same lesson the League itself had spent decades demonstrating through its ever-changing roster. That difference and multiplicity weren't threats to identity, but often the very thing that gave an idea room to keep growing. For the Justice League specifically, this meant a title and a team positioned once again as guardians not just of a single Earth, but of the broader multiversal structure now openly acknowledged as part of DC's ongoing continuity. The stories from this period continued to draw on the team's accumulated decades of history, weaving together threads from the Satellite era, the JLA years, the New 52, and Rebirth into a single, more expansive understanding of what the League had always represented across all of its many versions. This more expansive understanding also gave writers room to revisit and honor earlier eras of the team's history that had, in some cases, gone years without meaningful attention. Storylines from this period occasionally reached back toward specific moments and specific relationships established decades earlier in this very history. The Satellite era's found family warmth, the Justice League International years' particular blend of humor and heart, treating them not as outdated relics to be quietly forgotten, but as genuine, still resonant chapters within the team's ongoing, ever-expanding story. For long-time readers who had followed the League across some or all of the eras covered in this history, this approach offered a particular kind of satisfaction. The sense that nothing they had loved about the team across the decades had ever truly been erased, merely folded patiently into something larger. This willingness to treat the entirety of the League's history as simultaneously valid, rather than repeatedly overwriting one version with another, marked a genuine departure from the pattern established by the original Crisis on Infinite Earths and Infinite Crisis decades earlier. Where those events had largely been about simplification, about choosing one version of events and setting aside the rest, Infinite Frontier suggested a different philosophy entirely. That a team as layered and long-running as the Justice League didn't need to be simplified to remain meaningful. It could instead be understood as something closer to a single, continuous idea expressed differently across many different tellings, each one still mattering, each one still, in its own way, true. This expansive era led into Dark Crisis, published in 2022, a story that, true to the pattern established across the team's history, once again used a crisis-scale event to test the League and reshape elements of its ongoing story. Without dwelling excessively on plot specifics that continue to evolve even as this history is being told, Dark Crisis grappled directly with the loss of the League's most foundational members at a critical moment, forcing a new generation of legacy heroes, the sons, daughters, and successors of the original team, to step forward and prove themselves capable of carrying the League's mission forward, even in the absence of the icons who had defined it for decades. Characters who had spent years operating in the shadow of their more famous predecessors, training under mentors who often set impossibly high standards, suddenly found themselves without the luxury of that guidance, forced to decide, often in the middle of active crisis, whether they had truly internalized the values their mentors had tried to instill, or whether those values had only ever worked because someone more experienced was standing nearby to catch them if they faltered. That test, arguably, is the truest measure of whether any lesson in heroism has actually been learned. Not how a student performs while being watched, but how they perform once the person who taught them is gone. There's a particular kind of emotional weight to a story built around legacy heroes, stepping into roles once held by mentors and parents, one that resonates with themes present throughout this entire history. From the earliest Justice Society crossovers, through decades of new members earning their place among the team's ranks, the Justice League story has always carried an implicit question alongside its more immediate battles. What happens when the current generation of protectors can no longer answer the call, and who steps forward to answer it in their place? Dark Crisis asked that question more directly and more urgently than perhaps any prior Justice League story, and in doing so, it reaffirmed something the team has quietly demonstrated across every single era covered in this history. The mission has never truly depended on any one person, however powerful. It has always depended on the willingness of someone, anyone, to step forward when the world needs them most. Imagine, for a moment, the quiet that must have settled over the League's headquarters in the aftermath of a story like that. Empty corridors where familiar footsteps once echoed. A meeting table with a few too many empty chairs. And yet, gradually, footsteps returning, some familiar, some new, each one choosing all over again to answer a call that never really stops needing answering. That, more than any single victory or defeat, is the rhythm this entire history has traced across 6 decades of stories. Loss, followed by resolve, followed by someone somewhere deciding to keep going. This theme, legacy, the passing of a mission from one generation to the next, resonates powerfully with the League's entire 60-plus-year history. From the earliest crossovers with the Justice Society of America, DC's very first team of heroes, through decades of new members joining, older members stepping back, and entire rosters being reinvented, the Justice League has always been less about any single fixed lineup and more about an enduring idea. That when the world's need is greatest, someone will always answer the call, whether that someone is Superman himself or a hero who has trained their whole life for the chance to stand where he once stood. As of this telling, DC's Justice League continues to evolve, with new stories, new threats, and new interpretations of the team's core mission still being written. But the shape of the story, at its heart, remains exactly what it always was. Chapter 19: The Legacy of the Justice League. There's a reason this team has endured for more than 60 years, through crises and reboots, through comedic eras and cosmic ones, through rosters that grew, splintered, and grew again. It isn't really about the powers, impressive as they are. It's about what each member represents, and about the simple, enduring idea that those differences are exactly what make the team work. We've covered a great deal of ground together tonight. Quiet origins scattered across a farm in Kansas, an alley in Gotham, a hidden island, a laboratory accident, a distant sector of space, an ocean kingdom, and a dying red planet. We've watched 7 strangers become a family, watched that family grow and change across generations, watched entire universes rise and fall and reform around them, and watched, again and again, the same fundamental choice repeated by hero after hero across 6 decades. The choice to keep showing up, to keep trusting one another, to keep believing that the world is worth protecting even when protecting it costs everything they have to give. Superman represents hope, the belief that even someone capable of near limitless power can choose, again and again, to use it gently. Batman represents determination, the idea that even without any powers at all, a person can still stand shoulder to shoulder with gods through sheer will and preparation. Wonder Woman represents compassion joined with truth, the belief that strength and kindness were never opposites to begin with. The Flash represents optimism, a kind of everyday humanity moving at impossible speed, still choosing decency in every fraction of a second available to him. Green Lantern represents willpower itself, the idea that courage, translated into pure force, can hold back nearly anything. Aquaman represents another world entirely, a reminder that the planet holds more than what stands on dry land, and that leadership sometimes means belonging fully to no single place. And Martian Manhunter represents loneliness transformed slowly into belonging, the last of his kind who found, eventually, a new family among people who were nothing like him, and everything like him all at once. Think for a moment about what it might have felt like to be any one of them on the night they first realized they weren't alone anymore. Superman, who spent his whole life being the only one of his kind, suddenly standing beside 6 other people who understood, in their own different ways, what it meant to carry a burden most of humanity would never fully grasp. Batman, who had spent years methodically preparing to face the world's dangers entirely by himself, discovering that preparation and partnership weren't actually opposites after all. Martian Manhunter, the loneliest of them all, finding, almost by accident, something that had once seemed impossible. A genuine family, built not from blood or shared origin, but from shared purpose and hard-won trust. Whatever else this history has covered tonight, that particular feeling, the relief and wonder of discovering you don't have to carry everything alone, sits quietly underneath every single era we've walked through together. None of them are interchangeable. None of them could do what the others do. And that, more than any single villain defeated or any single crisis survived, is the real secret behind the Justice League's staying power. The team was never built on sameness. It was built on the idea that a hopeful farmer's son from Kansas, a driven detective from Gotham, a warrior princess from a hidden island, a scientist struck by lightning, a test pilot chosen by a ring of pure will, a king caught between 2 worlds, and a lonely visitor from a dead planet could set their differences beside one another, rather than against one another, and become something greater than any of them could ever be alone. It's worth remembering, too, how many other heroes have passed through the League's ranks across the decades we've covered tonight, each adding their own thread to this same tapestry. Green Arrow's insistence that heroism means something for ordinary people, not just those threatened by cosmic disaster. Black Canary's hard-won strength. Zatanna's reminder that not every mystery in the universe can be solved through science alone. Booster Gold's slow, funny, genuinely earned journey from self-interest toward real selflessness. Cyborg's blend of humanity and technology, forever balancing what he lost against what he gained. Each of these figures, and so many more we didn't have time to explore fully tonight, added something the Founding Seven alone couldn't offer. Further proof that the League has always grown stronger not by staying the same, but by continually opening its doors to whoever proves, through action rather than words, that they belong. Across every version of this story, from the quiet cave headquarters in Happy Harbor to the orbiting satellite above the clouds, from the international embassies of the late 1980s to the mythic, cosmic battlefields against Darkseid, that idea has never really changed. The world will always produce threats too large for one hero, and somewhere always, a group of very different people will choose to stand together against them anyway. There's something worth carrying with you, as this long history draws to its close, beyond simply the names and dates and eras we've walked through together tonight. It's the quiet suggestion, repeated across 60 years and dozens of creative teams, that the things which make us different from one another aren't obstacles to overcome on the way to real connection. They're the very foundation connection is built from. A team of 7 identical heroes, however powerful, would have collapsed under the weight of a single blind spot they all shared. It was precisely because Superman couldn't see the world the way Batman did, because Wonder Woman's instincts differed from Green Lantern's, because Aquaman understood an entire civilization none of his teammates could fully grasp, that the team became something durable enough to survive threats spanning galaxies and stretching across decades of continuity. That's a gentle thing to sit with as you drift toward sleep tonight. The people around you, the ones who see things differently than you do, who bring different strengths and different blind spots to whatever you're facing together, aren't necessarily obstacles either. Sometimes, difference is simply what completeness looks like, arriving in more than one shape at once. Perhaps right now, high above the sleeping Earth, the watchtower drifts quietly through orbit, its corridors dim, its members resting between missions, the planet turning slowly beneath them, calm and unaware of how many times it has been saved by people who simply decided, over and over, that it was worth protecting. That's where we'll leave them tonight, watching over a world that is finally, quietly at rest.